Would you get anybody else joining?
We've had a few more steering committee members log in.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started then. Good morning and welcome to the December 13th, 2021 RUC Steering Committee meeting. Today's meeting is being recorded for those who are unable to attend today. I want to first acknowledge the departure of former Senator and now Secretary of State Steve Hobbs. I want to thank him for his service to not only this committee, but to the state. The commission will be working with the legislature to secure his replacement during the 2022 session. And as a reminder, during the presentations, please make sure your microphones are turned off. I will now turn the meeting over to Era so she can give us Zoom instructions. Roll call.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Roy. Yes, I think this is a familiar slide for everybody at this point, but always good to have a reminder. We just ask that you stay on mute when not speaking. That just helps everybody be able to hear the presenters. If you need to update your Zoom name, you can do that in the participant tab by clicking on that and then more. You can also hit the little three dots next to your picture window. When we get to Q&A sections, we ask that you use the reactions button there at the bottom panel to raise your hand. And then Roy will call on you in the order that you've asked. We also have chat available for panelists to ask questions, as well as our attendees to ask questions of the panelists. And then my number's there on the screen. If you have any technical difficulties, you can either send me a chat in the Zoom or you can send me a text. And then I think we'll go ahead and call the roll from here. If I'm just going to do a quick check of our folks who've logged in since I started talking to make sure I didn't miss anybody. And it may be that more folks join as I talk, so we'll have to play a little bit of catch up perhaps. But I'll go ahead and share who I know who's on at this point. Starting with Bo Perschbacher. If you could just unmute yourself and just acknowledge that you are in fact here and present, that would be great.
So Bo Perschbacher is actually out on paternity leave this month, and so I am covering for him. My name is Jill Johnson from the Department of Licensing. Thank you.
Okay, welcome, Jill. Thanks. Okay, Kurt Augustine.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Pleasure.
Morning. Doug Vaughn.
Good morning.
Representative Orcutt.
Hi, I'm Representative Ed Orcutt. I represent the 20th District in Southwest Washington, and I'm on the Transportation Committee.
Commissioner Hester Cerebrin.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Janet Ray.
Happy holidays.
Kelly Fukai.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kelly Fukai, Commissioner from Spokane County.
Neil Strike.
I'm here. Good morning.
Senator Rebecca Saldana. Yeah.
I am here. I just have too many screens open.
No worries. Welcome. Thanks for being here. Ted Trepanier.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Tom Walrath.
Yes, present. Thank you.
Judy Clipper.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Welcome. All right. Are there any steering committee members who have logged on since I started talking and I did not call your name yet? Okay, Mr. Chair, I think that's concludes the roll call. Back to you.
And I'm Roy from Clark County Commissioner. So first up this morning, we'll get the 2021 state and federal RUC activities update from Travis. Travis, take it away.
Thank you, Roy. Good morning, everybody. I have a very brief presentation. We thought we would kick off this steering committee meeting with a brief update on RUC activities around the country, because we haven't done that in over a year, and there have been quite a few updates that have taken place both at the state level and the federal level that we thought you might be interested to hear about. And then after that, we will get to the content of our update program, which will start with the research updates on the 4 research tasks, the first part of the meeting. And then in the second part of the meeting, we're going to be walking through in some detail the mini pilot test proposal for next year. So very excited to be able to pull that together and share it with you all today. And I know many of you took part in the spotlight sessions throughout the fall that led us up to these pilot proposals. So thank you for your participation in those meetings, which helped us shape the concepts that we'll be presenting today. But on the National RUC update, just a couple of slides, but a lot of content. So on the next slide, you'll see the different states that have been active in road usage charging over the years. There are now 3 states that have legislation have enacted RUC programs. Of course, Oregon was the first one to go, enacted their legislation in 2013, and the program started in 2015. Utah came next with legislation in 2018, and the operational program launched on January 1, 2020. I think they have closer to 5,000 or 6,000 vehicles enrolled at this point. Like Oregon, Utah's program is optional. Its eligibility is for electric, plug-in hybrid, and hybrid vehicles who can enroll and pay by the mile instead of paying a flat annual surcharge. So several thousand vehicles have opted to do that in Utah. The third state to enact a program was Virginia, which did so last summer, and they expect to go live with their operational program on July 1st, 2022. So they had about a 20-month period from enactment to expected launch date. Virginia's program is a little bit different from Utah and Oregon. RUC eligibility, or mileage-based user fee, they call it, eligibility is any vehicle that's rated at 25 miles per gallon or higher. And what they've done is they've set an annual vehicle registration surcharge on each vehicle that's rated above 25 mpg. And the amount of the surcharge increases with vehicle mpg. And it's designed to offset the gas tax reductions from those vehicles. So the higher your fuel economy, the less gas tax you pay. So that flat fee increases a little bit with each mpg, and it caps out at, I think it's $90 for electric vehicles. So vehicles can, just like in Oregon and Utah, opt to pay by the mile instead of paying that flat fee. The only difference being that the rate is different depending on your MPG. It actually gets higher with MPG, and vehicles that are eligible, again, are those rated 25 miles per gallon and above. In addition to those 3 live operational programs, or rather 2 live and 1 going live next year, you can see a number of states highlighted in gray or blue that have conducted pilot tests, including Washington, as well as several states that have conducted independent research. And when I say independent research, I mean independent of one of the 2 major consortia. In the West, we have the RUC West Consortium, which are the states outlined in dark blue. And then in the East Coast, there's the Eastern Transportation Coalition, which covers most of the states on the East Coast, as well as Tennessee and Alabama. So that consortium has also conducted a series of pilot tests with participants from the 4 states you see called out there: Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and North Carolina. And I believe they have a new phase coming online next year with participants from new states as well. In addition, you see 2 new states that have begun an exploration for road usage charging in Kansas and Ohio. Both of them have taken advantage of the same grant program that has funded the work that that has gone on in Washington for the past several years, which is the STSFA, Surface Transportation System Funding Alternatives Program. And then lastly, California, of course, continues its research. A bill was enacted this year that directs the state to conduct a RUC pilot with real money collected. There are actually two different pilot tests, one that will have a flat per mile fee, and a second one that will have a fee that adjusts for the MPG of the vehicle. So you would actually have a lower rate for higher MPG vehicles, which is the opposite of the Virginia program. Question from Senator Fortunato. And welcome, Senator.
Yes, thank you, Travis. I'm sorry. Can you just mentioned the higher rate, lower rate MPG? Could you review that again? I wasn't quite clear that if you had a higher MPG, you paid more per mile or less per mile? What was that?
So in Virginia, the rate you pay per mile increases with vehicle MPG. And the idea is if you have a 25 mile per gallon vehicle, you're already paying most of what you need to pay through the gas tax. So you only have to pay a little bit extra to get even with the average vehicle. Whereas if you have a hybrid that gets 50 miles per gallon or an electric car, you're paying less already in gas tax. So the additional amount you would pay in per mile charge needs to be higher. So that's the logic behind the rate setting in Virginia.
Right, okay. And then compare that to California.
California's the exact opposite. So they're going to be testing two different approaches, one that's a flat per mile fee, and then a second pool of volunteers that are going to have a fee that is reduced. So you have a higher per mile fee for lower MPG vehicles and a lower per mile fee for higher MPG vehicles. The idea there is to reward fuel efficiency in line with their climate objectives, I suppose.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Orcutt.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One, it looks like Connecticut is crosshatched, so it's different from other states, but it doesn't show on your slide what the difference is. And then the other question is, it shows 4 states with pilots in a regional truck pilot, and that's Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and North Carolina. My question is, are those states not part of IFTA?
All 48 lower states are part of IFTA, International Fuel Tax Agreement. The test that was run on the East Coast with the Eastern Transportation Coalition actually cut across borders. It was nationwide in a sense. They had participating trucks from a number of East Coast states, and miles were driven all around the country. What they did was simply test whether they could enact measure and assess a per mile charge on those trucks across state borders, similar to how IFTA operates, but they did it on a mileage basis as opposed to IFTA, which is based on fuel consumption. And then related to that, Connecticut, thank you for mentioning that. I crosshatched it, but we forgot to put a call out. Connecticut enacted a truck weight mile tax this year, which makes it the 5th state to have that. Oregon, New Mexico, Kentucky, and New York are the other 4. For years, states were eliminating the truck weight mile tax. So this is the first state to go back in the other direction and put one back into place. So that is expected, I believe, to launch in 2023. One more question, Senator Fortunato.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so this would require when they registered a car to attach an MPG onto each car based on manufacturer's specs, I would imagine, which is going to be different for highway versus city. How in the heck would they compensate for that? So I drive most of my mileage in the city, and then somebody else drives it in the rural area, and I'm getting 14 and they're getting 22, same car. How do they adjust for that?
Right.
And basically what we're saying is, we're just gonna make an educated guess at what your mileage is. And then we're gonna give you a credit, which is not an actual amount of gas tax that you paid. It's just a guess of the amount of gas tax that you paid. Is that correct?
Effectively, that's how it works. So first on the MPG rating, I believe the rating that they will use in Virginia is the combined city highway EPA rating. So the EPA does as you know, a highway MPG rating, city MPG rating, and then a blended rating that considers both. And I think it's something like 55% assumed miles driven city, 45% assumed driven highway, which of course individual circumstances will vary, but they'll take that combined number and use it as the basis for the per mile rate that you're charged. So effectively, it's as if you are getting a gas tax credit or offset for their educated guess based on that MPG rating. But the way it's written in law is that it's not written as a gas tax refund, although that is sort of the effect. It's written as a per mile charge on top of the gas tax, but where the rate scales with MPG.
I'm just making a guess here. Is it a gift of state money to a person that drives in a rural area and never drives in the city? His mileage is higher, but he's using the blended rate. So he's getting a gas tax credit based on the blended rate, but his mileage is actually more. So he's getting a more of a credit or less of a credit, or the other way around. If you're in the city and you're using a blended rate, your mileage is less, but you're getting a credit as if it's more. Yeah, so is that a gift of public funds?
Well, again, it's not the law in Virginia is not written as a credit. It's written as a MPG based tax. So the actual rating versus the manufacturer EPA rating versus your on-road performance. The tax is based on the rating, not the actual on-road performance.
Right. And so by not calling it a refund or not calling it a credit, they avoid the potential gift problem.
Correct. Probably
like
one
it.
thing that's not avoided though is customer confusion. And we've seen this in the pilots, including the pilot in Washington, where there was a gas tax credit or offset of some kind, and it was based on that EPA rating. Oftentimes people will call in and ask or complain, hey, the rating you used is different from what I get. But unless you're using a device that can measure the actual fuel consumption, the next best thing is to use the EPA rating. And of course that results in individual circumstances that vary from that rating and then more customer questions about it.
Okay. Thanks for adding to the confusion. Thank you.
All right. In addition to these state activities, there has been some federal updates. On the next slide, you'll see the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is what Federal Highway Administration is calling the bill that recently passed Congress, has two different RUC programs. First is a continuation of the grant program. They have charitably renamed it to the, oh gosh, I've forgotten what it stands for because it's easier to pronounce. It's the SIRC program. So it's basically the STSFA program renewed. It has $75 million funded over 5 years. It increases the federal allowable share of costs to support grants up from 50% up to 70 or 80%. Funding is available through this program to support implementation of programs in addition to pilots. And the eligibility has been expanded to include not just states and groups of states as the previous program, but also local governments and metropolitan planning organizations. The recommendations that come out of these state grant programs are required to inform the exploration of alternatives for a national RUC program. And on that count, on the column on the right, this law creates a national RUC advisory board, and it directs the U.S. Department of Transportation to conduct a 50-state pilot, a national pilot of mileage-based fees. Several interesting features of this provision. That National Advisory Board will be a panel of experts selected by USDOT, and their job will be to oversee the design of a national pilot as well as a national outreach effort. It will also require, as I said, 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico. What's meant by a 50-state pilot is that volunteers should be recruited from all states. Real money would be collected in this pilot, and rates would be set by the Treasury Department. So as a result of that, the law directs the US DOT to collaborate with Treasury in designing and fielding this pilot test. Given that this bill just passed into law last month, or was signed last month, I think it's safe to say it's still early days, and many of the details remain to be worked out by FHWA about how exactly this program will proceed. Questions?
I'm sorry, I keep butting in, but where's the money go? If the feds collect the money, do they keep the money and then dole it out to us and we have to beg for it? Or do they just funnel money back to us after running it through their bureaucracy?
The money, I believe, is deposited in the Treasury. Or is it the highway fund? As maybe one of my colleagues remembers from having reviewed the bill. I can look into that and give you a
yeah, so the
answer.
question comes in is, okay, it goes into the federal highway money and then we have to beg to get it back. Or does it go into an account specifically for us and then they just, forward us the money? So
Travis,
that's
maybe it would be good to clarify, are we talking a federal program that only deals with the federal gas tax?
Yes. So this would be designed to be a replacement of the federal gas tax. So the funds would go into the highway fund, and this would be a very small amount of money because it's a pilot scale. It's not a national scale program with millions of vehicles. So the funds would be distributed in the same manner as the funds that are already programmed out through this highway bill.
So they're saying get rid of the federal gas tax and replace it with a federal mileage tax.
That's the concept. So the mechanism for doing that is similar to what the states like Washington have done, is to test it out with a pilot program as a first step.
All right, thank you.
Travis?
Yes, Judy, please.
It's the first time I've spoken up, but this is really intriguing, and I don't feel very knowledgeable. So can you clarify for me, if we're going forward as states with different road user charges based on our states and partnerships, then this comes in, and even though it doesn't necessarily deal with the same taxing level, we are coordinating so that we don't have the separate impacts on the individual. Is that right?
That's basically right. I think Congress has been following what the states have done. In fact, one of the members of the Transportation Committee in the House, T&I Committee, held up the report from the Washington pilot in 2019 and said this is a great example of the type of research that we could be doing to get insights on how to set up a program. Representative Sam Graves made that compliment to your work from earlier. I think it's safe to say that Congress is not interested in setting up a system that would add to confusion or complexity of how this is collected by one or more states, but rather is looking to see how a national program could be set up that would be complementary to that. And two things in the law are meant to help that. One is the fact that there is a continuation of the state programs, the CERC program, which is now called the STSFA, and the insights from that, again, are meant to inform the design of a national pilot. And the second mechanism is that the members of this National Advisory Board are drawn from a number of organizations that are enumerated in the bill, but including specifically states, state departments of transportation, and agencies that have administered pilot programs under the state grant program. So they're looking for the experts from the state level to be involved in crafting what will become a national pilot.
Perfect.
I hope that helps
Good
answer the
answer.
question.
Good answer.
Okay. Very good. And I can confirm that the funds from the pilot will be deposited for the benefit of the Highway Trust Fund, and that the name of the state program, SIRC, stands for Strategic Innovation in Revenue Collection. So there you have it. Any other questions on the RUC update from elsewhere in the country? And if not, I will hand it back to Roy. Thank you for your questions.
Okay, so our next presentation is going to be multiple presenters, and it's going to take us to approximately lunch. So that everybody knows, I plan to break for lunch at around 2:15. So with that being said, Zubar Bear, it will cover our progress on various research tasks that are nearing completion. Zubair, please take it away.
Thanks, Roy, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for having us here. It's really a pleasure to be with you all. So I will be presenting and updating you with the financial model and what we have been doing. So if you can move to the slide, please. So overall, what we have done here is that when we began with data collection, and we updated and enhanced financial model, developed that, added many features to it with many considerations that we felt were extremely important. And I will go over these. Then we also went a direction, which I will elaborate more, on a direction of scenario planning to address the uncertainty and keeping it a more flexible approach rather than hard forecast of a future that is by its very nature uncertain. Then we obviously did revenue projections by scenarios and have also developed a very simple analytical tool to facilitate users, instead of knowing the structure of the spreadsheet model, be able to perform analyses using a user-friendly application. I'll just show a screenshot of that.
For all general inquiries, including questions on hotel reward programs, please.
Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So our overall approach has been that we obviously updated and developed financial model. And as I said earlier, identified factors that potentially affect travel. And we'll talk more on that. And then we created an integrated framework to integrate these factors and incorporate them in the analysis. And obviously, we'll share we developed scenarios that I'll share with you and performed analysis, scenario planning type analysis on each of these scenarios. Next slide, please. So the actual update of the, next one, please. The actual update of the financial model, I wanted to first touch on several of the data sets and pieces of information that we considered in this process. Obviously, the first one is vehicle miles, the actual travel, in which we use these three sources: Washington State OFM, and also obviously Federal Highway HPMS data, state level, and then US Energy Information, EIA data. The reason I'm mentioning these three, because these three are kind of different in their nature and provided us different perspectives of the travel and forecasts of VMT under multiple scenarios. Then commute patterns, one of the big issues that we have talked about earlier as well, was trying to quantify work from home or changes in commute patterns as a result of COVID, and going forward, bringing kind of permanent changes to people's travel behavior. For that purpose, we use integrated public use micro data series, which is basically a derivative of the census data itself, and provides very useful information on people's commute patterns based on their employment type. And Census Bureau National Highway Travel Survey data we also used for some stratification of trip purposes. On the energy and fuel consumption side, as I mentioned earlier, US Energy Information Administration. The reason we use this data is that it has a lot of stratification, as some of you may be aware, by fuel type, and also to capture the other bookend of the forecasts of technology and electrification. We refer to Bloomberg, which is aggregate in nature, but provides us a kind of a, which I call the other end of the spectrum, and being the very optimistic, but that we used as the other end of the spectrum, if you will. As well as the last one is something that was very unique to this project, that we requested data from the Department of Licensing, and I will speak to it more. But what we did was that we used the actual vehicle ID number VIN data and decoded that to determine the fleet composition, which was a highly analytical process. But we used that data for the state of Washington, which added a lot of value to the financial model itself. So these were basically the data sets that we used and incorporated in our model. Next slide, please. And then a continuation of that is that in terms of once we had a handle on those data sets, the model this is a continuation of what I just spoke earlier, that VMT, obviously we had a handle. Then electrification forecasts came from Bloomberg and EIA. Shifts in commute patterns came from the IPUMS data. Then the fourth one, another pandemic, hopefully not, but we added a slot in our model to incorporate for downward adjustment of the revenue in case of any event like what we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. So there is a possibility of adjusting the revenue to anticipate, or not to anticipate, but rather to quantify the potential impact. Then the e-commerce impact on its information that we took from National Highway Travel Survey, again, to make sure that we incorporate these effects of different moving parts on the travel itself. Then the next one, temporal and technology. This is important because we have certain assumptions, certain expectations in regards to electrification as well as autonomy. So considering electrification and autonomy separately is also something that we have incorporated and have slots in our model to consider those. Then urban and rural, this is something extremely important. The way we have developed our model, that you can separately see the revenue, expected revenue separately from urban and rural. And I will speak to some assumptions that we made. The point has been to consider factors that value the fact that urban and rural are separate in terms of travel, and we can't just deal with both of them the same way. So we have tried to capture that difference in urban and rural areas as well. Next slide, please. So this is just intended to give you a big picture perspective of the adjustments that we make to the vehicle miles travel. We begin with a baseline VMT, and here, as you see here, I see per VMT growth scenario. So we haven't gone into this project, which is unique about this, called scenario planning, that we don't say that this is the forecast of VMT for 2050 or 2035 or so on. We rather provide a framework that provides users and us the ability to go with any among our assumed or potential scenarios of VMT, from aggressive to more slower growth. That's what we mean by per VMT growth scenario. So we take that and then we adjust for telecommute impacts. So what this does is that you may have an aggressive VMT growth scenario, but at the same time, you have to incorporate for an aggressive increase on e-commerce, on telecommuting. So such adjustments and combinations are possible, that you can use VMT scenario selection independent of the telecommute, So, and you can mix and match these different moving parts together. Same is true for electrification, that you can go with Bloomberg as being the most optimistic forecast, yet keep VMT growth to something less than aggressive, and so on. I'm just giving you an indication of what type of possibilities exist in this financial model, that we can mix and match different assumptions to generate, if you will, different potential futures. And I will speak to this a little bit later, why we did this and what's the benefit in doing that. Again, as I mentioned earlier, for autonomous vehicles and shared ride, we have accounted for those by providing user modifiable assumptions in there. Next slide, please. Here, I am just, again, for illustrative purposes, this is conceptually like a waterfall type situation that we begin with in context of how to quantify the people who have been working from home prior to COVID, because they are the most to continue, and more people, because it's a function of the type of work. So we refer to the IPUMS data, which provided us total employed, and then adjusted, out of which those which, based on their response in the survey, work from home. And then out of those work from home, those who drive when they actually go to work sometime. So if they ever go to work and they take a train, we did not, at least for this purpose, did not include those. So the purpose of this was to get to an estimated number of people who are susceptible or more potentially more probable to be continuing to work from home in those occupations, so that we can extrapolate for those as a baseline number. Instead of assuming that statewide we assume this much, it is still aggregate, but it is based on an actual number coming from survey responses. So that's what is being demonstrated here, that we were able to get to a point where we are confident that yes, we captured a value as a baseline number, which represents people who have been working from home belonging to certain occupations. Next slide, please. Here is for just out of the goal here is to illustrate what type of information exists in the data that we used. So what you see here is a summary of employment types and work from home trends, work from home breakdown in urban/suburban areas. So the graph that you see on the top left is employment by job categories belonging to each of these. I don't want you necessarily mean to read through each one of these, but as you see, the data includes information by these occupations, and these are aggregated. The actual list is like 300 plus occupations. So these are broad job categories. Then from those, you see in the graph on the center is a breakdown of work from home proportion from each of the job categories. Then the bottom graphic is a qualitative representation showing the relative comparison of each occupation and its propensity to work from home based on actual data. So this is urban/suburban because this data treats both of those together. In the next slide, you see the difference between urban and rural. So this is again a rural counterpart of what you just saw that shows a different breakdown of work from home categories and work from home proportion of different occupations. So the point here that I wanted to make without wasting more time on this is that the data that we used had an inherent sensitivity to urban and rural proportion of people working from home by occupations. That's the message here. And we can slice and dice this in many different ways, but that's the purpose of sharing this information with you. Next slide, please. So here is, before we go into the actual forecasts and some more, I wanted to give you a general indication of the comparison of electrification forecasts. So the lowest line that you see here is the green, which is also overlapped by another line from economic forecast from EIA. We basically did not use that one. We rather used what is called EIA's high oil price scenario. And as some of you may know, that EIA model is based on the NEMS model, which is National Energy Management System. It's based on a large database of national pieces of information. It's basically an econometric model. Then the other end of the spectrum, as I had mentioned earlier, is Bloomberg, highly optimistic, saying that by 2050, about 50% of VMT will be represented by electric vehicles. We felt that this gap is too large. So for the purposes of our analysis, we took an average middle ground, which is shown by the dashed line here. So these are the three cases, if you will, of the electrification forecasts that we have considered in our analysis. Next slide, please. So here is another assumption that I wanted to share with you. While people can argue with the actual year, but the goal here was to share with you, for example, in the gray boxes, that in urban level 5 completely autonomous vehicles, because we adjust the VMT based on what proportion of vehicles is level 5 autonomous. So we say that by 2035, potentially we could see a noticeable number of these vehicles on the road in urban areas. But we don't use the same for 2040. We say that it will at least take 5 more years to see those vehicles on rural roads. While one can argue that the gap between 35 and 40 is not enough, but at least we consider that that difference in urban and rural. Same is true for the mobility shuttles, which are self-driven type shuttles that we could see them in 2030 on urban roads versus 2035 on rural roads. So the point here that I wanted to make is that while one can argue that it could be another year, but at least we created a sensitivity between urban and rural assumptions related to electrification and autonomy. Next slide, please. Before I go into this, I don't know if it makes more sense to take a pause here, or you want me to continue to the end of my presentation, because there's just too much information. So if someone has some immediate question, I can answer before I go into this set of slides. So hearing none, I'll continue. So as I had mentioned that we used the data from Department of License, and this data included about 6.7 million records of vehicle vehicle ID numbers. And there's a process of decoding the VINs which we developed, which exists, but we incorporated that and developed an in-house code that would decode those VINs. And we were able to decode about 6.1 out of the 6.7 million records. Then using the VINs and other assumptions, we also were able to not just know the things such as model year of the vehicle and so on, we also were able to estimate the fuel efficiency of vehicles. So it becomes a multi-dimensional data, which includes the breakdown of vehicles by model year. And for each model year, it includes the breakdown by fuel economy. So this data was extremely powerful. And again, it was specific to the state of Washington. And this was used in our model to determine the fleet composition based on model year and fuel efficiency, to which we applied scrappage assumption and many such things. So the point here being that our model includes this type of very specific information about the state of Washington in terms of fleet composition and fuel economy and age of vehicles and so on. Next slide, please. So this is again an example of the type of information that we were able to extract from that data. This is a piece of information that comes from the output of our financial model. As you see on the left side, as we go forward in terms of time, and I will explain what this overdrive scenario is. It's a little bit jump here, but I wanted to share this because this falls in context of the DOL data. So as you see the increase in total number of vehicles on RUC as going forward, and the color shading here represents the breakdown of those vehicles by a model year. It's a little bit excessive in terms of colors and graphs, but that's what this represents. On the right side, as you see the vehicles on fuel, they are expected to go down and the color breakdown here represents the model year. So this is something that I wanted to share, that the model inherently includes this ability and this information, which is sensitive to the age of vehicles, fuel economy, fuel efficiency of the vehicles, as well as even their breakdown by model year. Next slide, please. So after having all those components that I just shared, the challenge was to, you can move to the next slide, please. The challenge was to create a set of scenarios that first create a system that would adjust or that would address all these moving parts and blend them into a system that you could paint different pictures and get revenue forecasts for each of those. So our thought process basically included that the scenarios should cover a broad spectrum of future conditions. This is extremely important given the uncertainty coming from things like COVID, from telecommute, from electrification, from autonomy and all those type of factors, and e-commerce, obviously. Then some of these, or most of these, are also sensitive going forward, that what would be the longer term effect of these. So we have to use a temporal perspective of these as well. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, scenario analysis to capture, have the ability to capture urban and rural differences when it comes to revenue forecasts. Next slide, please. So this was our, I would say, a broad process, thought process, if you will. This slide is important because this compares the traditional planning process with what we call scenario planning. And the reason this is important, that our traditional transportation planning process, which is not bad in itself, which is based on certain needs and requirements in itself, but a lot of times those forecasts are based on such a forecast such as, this is our 2050 population forecast, this is our 2050 traffic forecasts, and so on. So those forecasts are based on hard forecasts of contributing factors, which then are used to estimate traffic and emission and all those things that we are aware of. The other approach is what is called risk management or risk analysis, which generally looks into ranges and that tries to perform things like Monte Carlo simulation, trying to generate numerous combinations, and then looks at that as an extension to the traditional forecasts. The scenario planning process is slightly different in the sense that, number one, it starts with trying to paint, if you will, various pictures of future, which we call future 1, future 2, future 3, and so on. So what if a future looks like this? What if the future looks like that, and so on? And this is extremely beneficial because in today's age, with so many uncertainties and so many moving parts, one can hypothesize different scenarios and then look at what could be the assumptions that are in our control, or what could be the steps that can be taken to address any of these scenarios and prepare for those accordingly. Secondly, it allows us to look at more of a sensitivity analysis among those bookends of scenarios. So that's how scenario planning process, and it's being widely used by agencies. One of the biggest documented example is Shell, the oil company Shell, using scenario planning in the 60s to prepare for an oil embargo type scenario that happened in early 70s. And they actually had a official scenario in place to handle that type of situation, and they were able to handle that. Scenario planning is also used by very sensitive agencies such as even US Army. That it's a well-documented and well-known approach used by many big players in industry. So it's a very well-known, and it's been adopted a lot more than it used to be. I wanted to touch on this. This is the approach, this is the approach that we feel is more appropriate for something like this. Next slide, please. So again, another few considerations of scenarios that one cannot identify scenarios based on a single factor. Let's say call it low economic growth, for example. Low economic growth itself is tied to so many other things and so on. Then again, there are so many factors that capturing all possible combinations of those will not be practical. So what we have done is that then we define, you can call it baseline, we have given it a different name. And then we have developed 5 scenarios, and we will study maybe 3 or even 5, all 5 of them in greater detail as you will. We have studied them in more detail, as you'll see in the slides that follow. Next slide, please. Again, these are factors. I would skip this slide. This basically reiterates the same kind of thing in favor of time. I will skip this. Go to the next slide, please. Then again, these are those that we selected to define our scenarios, so that those which are which have the most effect on travel. Next slide, please. Maybe the names are new to you, but these are the names that we felt would be interesting. So we named a scenario neutral, which basically represents kind of a continuation of past growth and trends, and not very active or aggressive technology adoption. The next level is cruise control, which, as the name indicates, represents a moderate increase and so on. So overdrive, the next one, represents an aggressive growth in economic growth and high electrification rate and so on. The last 2 are variants of these. So the shared drive is again a representative of aggressive growth, but focuses a little bit more towards the shared drive culture. And low gear is basically a lower end of the spectrum, if you will, which actually adds a pandemic to the neutral kind of thing. So if you go to the next slide, we have a different representation of these scenario assumptions. So broadly speaking, as you see, green being the low and red being the high, and yellow and orange being the medium and moderate. So this is like a graphical representation of our broad assumptions that went into these scenarios. As you see on the left is more green and yellow on the neutral, which starts having a little bit of orange, and then overdrive has so many reds. Between overdrive and shared drive, you see a little bit dampening, but then at the bottom, if you notice, more shared mobility than drive. And low gear on the rightmost is mostly green, as you see. So this is more of a qualitative representation of these scenarios. And we selected these names just to go with the theme of naming scenarios versus calling them scenario 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. Next slide, please. So here we'll share some results from our scenario analysis. So if you go to the next slide, this is, as I had mentioned earlier, this slide could have been brought at the very end, but I felt it'll be interesting for us to share this before we share the results. So this is a software tool that we have developed. The spreadsheet itself has become fairly complex and difficult for people to quickly analyze different scenarios. So as you see on the top, there are drop-down choices that the users can just select a representative choice for a scenario. So a combination of these can be used to paint a picture, if you will, and then click on apply selections, and the model internally computes the results and updates the graphs and everything. Then you have these sliders which you can play with for miles per gallon cutoff representation of RUC. This is more complex in the model itself, but for the sake of simplicity, I've shared these. Then at the bottom, these are clickable buttons that if you click on any one of these named scenarios, it basically automatically selects those values that we have selected for these. These are like, you can click on a scenario and then adjust that further, and then click on apply selections and so on. So here in the next few slides, if you move to the next slide, please. They represent the revenue broken down by urban and rural by the blue and orange. For example, this is neutral. And if you go to the next scenario, you'll see a little bit growth coming from cruise control, which represents, as I had mentioned, higher growth. And then the next one is the most aggressive one, which is overdrive. And then the next two are kind of like downwards. If you go to the next one, please, it's shared drive, which goes down. Then the lowest one going down to the low gear is it's slightly lower than the neutral, especially in the first 5 years where it goes down due to an assumed potential impact of a continuation of pandemic. And then on the next slide, we show a representative dashboard, which is part of the model itself, which is a full picture of what I shared in pieces in this slide, in these slides. So as you see on the top, these graphs update automatically based on the scenario that the user selects. So you see the middle two graphs on the right. I shared with you what those were. That's why I showed them earlier. And then the bottom two on the left are revenues. These are for the purpose of this demo, these are gross revenues. But in the model, we have cost scenarios, which represent different assumptions related to the cost of collection. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the difference in one versus the other. So if this is overdrive, and if you go back to the first one, to the previous one, you see the difference in these two. So this is like a report that provides a lot of information. The user can go back and change these as part of the analysis itself. So next slide, please. So basically, I tried to, in a short period of time, my apologies for dumping a lot of information in a short period of time. And believe it is a lot more, but I just wanted to keep it somewhat simple and address all the aspects of our. So we have finalized our model. We are documenting that, and then the knowledge transfer to the commission folks and share those inside details of the model, just so that people can play around and perform additional analyses. So the beauty here is that there's so much flexibility in this model, as you saw, that one can see a lot of variations in potential assumptions and mix and match different scenarios and so on. So we hope that this will provide a good tool. This will be a good tool to capture different variations and different assumptions going forward. So I will stop here. That was my target, to stop in half hour and give you the next 10 minutes for any questions that anyone has. So I'll pause here, and any questions, comments, clarifications, we'll be more than happy to address that. I know it has been a lot of information, but this is nature of the beast itself. That
Doesn't look like there's any. Doesn't look like there's any.
That's fine. That's fine, but feel free to reach out to us. Any questions, thoughts, or comments, we'll be more than happy to share those with you, to clarify those with you. So with that, thanks a lot, everyone, and really a pleasure to share this information with you. And
Roy, can you hear me? Can you hear me? It's Sharon Nelson.
Yes, I
Go ahead,
can.
Sharon.
I'm using a device I've never used before. So I'm not sure what it does. I just wanted to say that presentation was fascinating. As someone who's heard all kinds of future scenario plannings in the utility rate setting context, I'm impressed with the quality, flexibility, and factors that can be thrown into this mixer and used. I'm really amazed. And so I don't have any questions, but I just want to say thank you very much for the work.
You're welcome. Really, thank you very much. Thanks for the acknowledgement and thanks for the support. Really appreciate that. All right, so I'll hand it over to Travis. And thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Zubair. Our team is having a lot of fun playing with that toy. So we invite you all, if you have scenarios you'd like to consider, to send them our way, and we'll put them through the model. I will do a very brief interlude on rate setting considerations. We felt like it fit sort of here in the presentation after the after the presentation of the financial model, which has the ability, as Sharon just commented or observed, to consider a variety of different approaches, not only to the economic conditions around transportation revenue, but also the policy parameters, including rate setting. So this is very brief, but wanted to touch on a few issues and proposals that have arisen over the last year or so with regard to RUC rate setting. Next slide, please. Great. So first of all, just to back up a little bit and ask the question, what is the basis of setting a RUC rate? And we have, in the course of the research with the commission going back many years, and in the pilot and in the legislative proposals that we have seen emerge in Washington and also in other states, generally relied on the third concept from this list, which is revenue replacement. So at least as a first step, the idea of a road usage charge is to replace a revenue mechanism that is waning, the gas tax. So rate setting is simply a mathematical exercise of figuring out, well, what's the equivalent per mile rate that can replace that revenue source. There are other bases that could be used as well, such as setting a revenue target and then calculating the per mile rate that's needed to generate that amount of revenue. That's how the RUC rate setting is done in New Zealand, for example, or cost recovery, which is similar in the sense that you're calculating what the cost is on the transportation system of a mile of driving, and then working to set a rate to recover that cost. You might come up with similar numbers across these three approaches, depending on the circumstances, but philosophically, there's different ways to go about it. Regardless of the basis, there are also potential factors that are available to vary the rate. And we've heard of several, and this ties back to the conversation at the beginning of the meeting. The second idea does anyway, but we've heard, for example, the idea of varying the rate based on vehicle weight, varying the rate based on the vehicle's energy efficiency, or based on the income of the vehicle owner. So I wanted to talk through the first two of these, and we'll reserve the third one for a presentation a little bit later on with regard to the possibility of offering targeted discounts for individuals who qualify as low income. So the next slide discusses the concept of varying the rate based on weight. And I think we've presented this material in the past to the steering committee, but because it has come up again recently, thought it was timely to reprise it, that for light vehicles, which basically are vehicles under about 10,000 pounds, so that's everything from a golf cart to an F-350, they have equivalent impacts on pavement, which is to say negligible impacts on pavements and bridge structures. So when pavements are being designed, the factors that matter are the loadings of heavy vehicles, heavy trucks, buses. And because roads are designed to accommodate these heaviest of vehicles, the actual impact of light duty vehicles by weight is negligible. So from an engineering perspective, varying the rate per mile charged based on vehicle weight isn't necessary, or at least there's no way to, from an engineering perspective, calculate how you would do that because the differences are negligible. So this speaks to the notion of having a flat rate for all light duty vehicles, at least based on the weight factor. The other idea that's recently been discussed is, as was raised at the beginning of the meeting on the next slide, the idea of varying the rate based on a vehicle's energy efficiency. We've seen this in both directions. We've seen the Virginia model, which has a higher rate per mile based on MPG to make up for lost gas tax revenue. We're showing here is the California proposal that will be pilot tested, which is to use energy efficiency ratings to discount the rate per mile. So one of the challenges of that approach is the pressure it puts on the gas tax. So focusing in on the table, we picked 4 sort of example vehicles. You can take an older model pickup, for example, that gets 17 miles per gallon, an average car of about 20.5, a hybrid at 48 miles per gallon, and a new electric car, which gets, let's say, 129 miles per gallon equivalent. It actually gets infinity miles per gallon because it doesn't consume gallons, but there is an EPA measure of the equivalent miles per gallon in electricity that it consumes. So the idea is that you could adjust the per mile rate based on the fuel efficiency. So you would end up with a higher rate for the pickup, that average car at the rate that we've been using in our research of 2.4 cents per mile, and an electric car paying, in this example, about 0.4 cents per mile. So you can see over 10,000 miles what the amounts owed would be. This concept has some challenges with regard to the revenue sustainability because it, as you can see, it puts a lot of pressure on the higher end of the table to carry the costs. And as vehicles increasingly move into the hybrid and electric category, the rate has to be raised on the fuel tax to make up for the loss, which sort of further spreads the difference between the older model vehicles and the newer ones. So Representative Orcutt, question, comment?
Thanks, Travis. So when we did the pilot, I started out on the odometer read, and it was showing that I was getting a rebate on my quarterly statements. Then when I went into the plug-in, it came back and said I was owing. So can you kind of talk about the differences there, why there were differences?
Sure.
And how that affects any of your assumptions here?
Can you remind me what type of vehicle? You have to say exactly which model, but you know, is SUV, pickup? Well,
at the time I had a 2005 Ford Escape all-wheel drive with a 3.0 6-cylinder engine.
Okay. So I think what was happening is that the odometer-based approach was relying on the EPA rating of your vehicle. And I think you said that it gave you a rebate. So presumably the EPA rating that it presumed was lower than what you were actually getting. So let's look it up. A 2005 Ford Escape, you said a 3-liter engine or 2.3?
3-liter 6-cylinder.
Okay, 19 miles per gallon. So unless it decoded to a different trim, you should have been pretty close to the break even or owing a very small amount. Then when you switched to the plug-in device, it was actually measuring your fuel consumed. So presumably you were getting better than 19 miles per gallon. You were maybe getting 23 if you're doing a lot of highway driving, for example. That's the highway rating for that vehicle. So in that instance, you would have owed a little bit because it was actually basing your fuel tax credit on the actual consumption as opposed to the rating. So that accounts for the difference between the rated amount and the actual on-road amount. So the different methods we tested, the only one that could actually measure fuel consumption was the plug-in device. For all the others, we relied on the EPA rating. Jan.
Yeah, so just a comment. I think it's interesting to see the California model where I understand that they're trying to incentivize moving to higher, better fuel efficient vehicles. However, I also think could be short-sighted because as we move towards having more electric, more autonomous vehicles, it would seem to me that providing an infrastructure that those vehicles could go upon is going to add costs out there. And so all of a sudden you're saying, we want you to get these cars, you don't have to pay, but now you can't drive them because we don't have enough money to do all of the updates. So just a comment. I think it's interesting and we can certainly incentivize activities, but that's not how our study had been set up to begin with all those many years ago.
Thank you, Jan. I don't see any other hands up. The only other rate factor that we mentioned a minute ago that again will come up in a future presentation here today is the notion of providing income-based discounts. So you'll hear more about that later. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Allegra. Oh, sorry, let's hold back. We have a question, hand up from Hester.
Thanks, Travis. That's a helpful context. I wondered, and this actually ties back to the tool presentation. Given that different rate structures could potentially influence people's behavior, does the tool we have actually let us go kind of change directionality such that if we put in different rate structures, we can actually see what VMTR, what the impacts might be on different income impacts might be on different populations, or is it just assuming one rate revenue is the only outcome we can look at?
We can assume different rates, but the outcome that the tool produces is revenue. There's no impact on driving behavior based on the per mile rate. And the reason we didn't include one is because the universe of rates we've been exploring in Washington has been relatively low for having behavioral impacts. If you think of the total cost of driving averages around 60 cents per mile, and we're talking in the 2 to 3 cent ballpark, which is quite a small fraction of that, and in most cases it's already being paid through the fuel tax, so the additional amount is small. So we didn't presume any recursive impacts on driving behavior based solely on road usage charging. There might be some level of impact, but it's so modest that we just chose not to try and estimate it. It would require a lot of investment in stated preference surveys, for example, to determine what exactly those impacts might be.
Thanks. And then
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. And then my other question / comment is, I know that a lot of metropolitan planning organizations are undergoing various long-range transportation plans right now. I'm thinking particularly of PSRC, which makes certain assumptions about rates for VMT fee. And so maybe this is less of a question, more of a suggestion. I know that there's been kind of presentations back and forth, but maybe some closer staff collaboration to make sure that, because currently they're not the same assumptions, and so it'd be great to have a little bit more conversation there. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Annalise, if we could go to the next slide, I'm going to hand it off to Allegra to talk through the second research task, and Henry. Thank you.
All right. Great. Thanks, Travis, and good morning, everyone. If we can just go to the next slide. Our team this morning is going to provide a brief recap of the work that we've presented at the May and November Equity Spotlight sessions. I'm pretty sure that most, if not all of you, joined those conversations. So we're going to keep the recap fairly brief to give it some context for the conversations you'll have about the pilot. But we're going to start with the financial analysis, which we spoke about, the furthest back last spring. And I'm joined today by Jay Shee and Chloe Kinsey. And then I'll pass it over to Henry Yates to discuss the focus group sessions. But before we dive in, I did want to just remind everyone of our charge for the work related to understanding the equity implications of a road usage charge. Obviously, the state's population is changing in terms of demographics, and we know right now that we have a wide range of incomes and household wealth across the state. So we don't want to go into policymaking assuming that we have a uniform population. And this is an attempt to understand what might some of those impacts be. So we can just move into the next slide and then one more. So with the financial, sorry, if you can go back one, with the financial analysis, it's a very specific analysis. There's a lot of conversation happening in our state and nationally about transportation equity. And we are looking at a very specific question, which is whether or not households in different income brackets would pay more or less under a potential road usage charge compared with what they're paying now for the gas tax. So that's what we looked at. And then we also looked at transportation taxes as a share of household expenditures. And I think that when we last met, we shared that we know that for low-income households, and the far left bar on the right portion of the chart is showing households with 30,000 or less of sort of household income, and transportation expenses are making up 40% there. So that a larger number than we see on the far right with the higher income households. And we also know that as a percent, fuel taxes are a small share of the overall transportation expenses compared to insurance and other costs. So currently we estimate that the fuel tax is about 4% of the transportation expenditures that low income households have in a given year. And with that, I will turn it over to Jay.
Thank you. Yeah, so turning to the analysis, so we looked at the question of whether households in different income brackets pay more or less under a road usage charge compared to the current gas tax under kind of two different lenses. So first, whether households would pay more or less on a per mile basis. And then next, whether households would pay more or less on a cumulative basis over the course of an entire year. So starting with gas taxes on this slide, you'll see estimated fuel tax paid per 10,000 miles driven for a variety of different income groups. And so we found that on average, lower income households pay more in fuel taxes than higher income households on a per mile basis. And that is due to the fact that on average, lower income households tend to drive less fuel efficient cars than higher income households. And you'll see that in our findings around that in the column in the middle of the table. And so in essence, lower income households are having to buy more gasoline than higher income households to drive the same distance, and therefore have to pay more in gas tax. So if we can go to the next slide. And however, when we look at this same question on a cumulative basis over the course of an entire year, we actually find that higher income households are paying more in fuel taxes than lower income households. And this is due to the fact that higher income households tend to drive more miles on average than lower income households over the course of an entire year. One reason for this might be the fact that higher income households also tend to own more vehicles than lower income households. And so household members have more of an opportunity to kind of log more miles than their lower income household counterparts. One other thing I'd like to also note is that in the data that we had access to, we weren't really able to kind of differentiate between types of miles driven. So whether miles were driven for commuting purposes or running errands or for leisure. The reason why I bring this up is it's often kind of a question that we get is whether higher income households are maybe logging more leisure miles than their lower income household counterparts. And unfortunately, we're unable to sort of answer that question with the data that we have access to. But so we just want to have that in your mind, and so that you're aware of that. So with that, I think we will turn to what this looks like for a road usage charge and how that would compare to a gas tax. And I'll hand it over to my colleague, Chloe.
Thanks, Jay. So as Jay covered, we reviewed what households of different income levels pay on average under the fuel tax, and we're looking now at what that looks like under a road usage charge. The first point is that under a RUC, all households would pay the same amount per mile driven. And that means that every household that drives 10,000 miles per year, which is around the average for Washington households, would pay the same total amount regardless of their vehicle's fuel efficiency. So that's what you're seeing in the chart here. So now we'll move on to the next slide. But as we reviewed earlier, higher income households tend to drive more total miles on average over the course of the year, which means that in total over a year, higher income households will generally be spending more in total on RUC than lower income households. So we'll now move on to the next slide. And what we find when we look overall is that what we expect households to spend on fuel tax versus RUC on average over the course of the year, when we look at that, the differences are small. And in our statistical analysis, we found that none of the differences within each of these income groups are actually large enough to be statistically significant. The reason for this is that for most households, the difference in what they would pay per mile under RUC versus the fuel tax is small enough that it doesn't amount to a large dollar difference, even over 10,000 miles driven. But of course, that's just looking on average. And the exception to this would be households that have very fuel efficient or very fuel inefficient vehicles and are also driving lots and lots of miles over the course of a year. So a household with a very efficient vehicle that's driving lots of miles would pay more under RUC than a gas tax, while a household with a very inefficient vehicle that's also driving lots of miles would pay less under RUC than the gas tax. And we know from our earlier analysis that households with less fuel efficient vehicles are more likely to be low income. So that means that we see to some extent an equalization between those low and high income households around fuel efficiency under RUC. So I will pause there for any questions on this section before we move on to the focus group sessions.
Hester, you have a hand up.
Thanks. I think, and I'm sorry if I missed this, we had talked last time about looking not just at the strict amount, but the amount as a percentage of households' income. I saw one slide, I think, at the beginning, but kind of comparing these changes. Is that, we're still able to do that, or do we have any additional takeaways?
Hester, can you just confirm what as a percent of the household income?
Oh, sorry, spending on RUC or gas tax as a percentage. So, yes, it's the same, across, pretty much the same across incomes, but as a percentage of their income, it's likely to be a lot more.
Yeah, right now, what we know from the data is that the fuel tax or the road usage charge would be about 4% of the transportation expenditures for lower income households.
Right.
Yeah.
And compared to higher incomes, do we have that?
The higher income would be, at the 150,000, it's 9% is in total is spent on transportation expenditures. So it's a much smaller share of the 9%, given that vehicle purchase, insurance, et cetera, is in that. Representative Orcutt, you have a hand.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about where some of these numbers come from. 40% of low-income individuals' household money goes to transportation. That seems a little bit high to me, especially with some of the other groups that I'm working on, all claiming that they've got some pretty high amounts. I mean, we've all heard that there are a lot of people in low-income brackets that are paying more than 30% for their housing. So between transportation and housing, that's now 70%. That leaves 30%. If you take somebody that's making $17,000 a year and they only have 30% left over after transportation and housing, that's $5,100 a year. If they have a $100 a week food bill, they're already $100 backwards. And these other groups are saying they're paying $1,000 in sales tax, which none of the items we're seeing here are sales tax items. So I'm wondering, how do we get to 40%? Where does that number come from? And is it realistic? Because it really does not sound realistic to me. And I think I've just put some evidence out there to suggest that these numbers are askew.
So they're averages from the 2019 Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey. And obviously at the individual level, it is going to look different. If someone's paying, a lot for housing, they may be not spending as much elsewhere, or only, for the people who are only using transit and don't have insurance or a vehicle purchase price, that wouldn't be included. But it's averaged out across the income groups from that expenditure survey. So it's the best data we have to try and do a quantitative look. And it's also a big piece of why Henry and Linda have been out speaking to people, so that we can sort of understand qualitatively, how does it feel for people on the ground? Because I agree, the averages, will never tell the whole story. Hester, you still have a hand up. Do you have a question still?
No, sorry.
No problem.
Rebecca does.
Yeah. Hi, Senator Saldana here. Yeah, I think it is alarming and does not all add up. I think that's why, we have so many people using our food banks and, not getting by and increasing their debt load because this all doesn't add up for if you are making less than $20,000 or $25,000 to live in Washington. And, so I think, it's hard for us to imagine, but I think this is the lived experience of a lot of Washingtonians. This is just why I think we are, trying to look at equity from a couple of different lenses and figure out what makes sense, because really, your transportation tax portion to the state is really pretty nominal. It's the other pieces that people are paying where, we see it taking up a big chunk of their income.
Thanks for that. All right, well, seeing no other questions now, and we can certainly go back at the end of Henry's presentation as well. We'll hand it over to Henry Yates.
Thank you, Allegra. Henry Yates, I'm with Yates Consulting, a part of the CDM Smith team. My firm's been doing community outreach work for the last 12 years or so, and much of our work is done in communities of color, vulnerable populations. Why don't we move to the next slide, and I will once more go over the charge that was made to us, identify and measure potential disparate impacts of RUC to communities of color, low-income household, displaced communities, vulnerable populations through targeted outreach and engagement. We are using 3 methods of outreach and engagement. The biggest portion, and we're wrapping this up, are focus groups. We're doing surveys. We're also doing one-on-one interviews with individuals. We've now completed about 16 focus groups with 3 in Eastern and Central Washington. Important to note that most of those focus groups have been in person. Next slide. You can see who we've been talking with, a variety of ethnicities, races. As I mentioned previously, we've got some demographic diversity in here as well. We've done we've done focus groups in Bremerton, Kent, Yakima. We were just in the Tri-Cities. We've talked to some statewide groups. We've also, it's important to note, spoken with some individuals that are part of that more vulnerable population group, and that is one of the groups that would represent that sector is our folks from Disability Rights Washington. We have also conducted some of these focus groups online using Zoom or Teams, and they've been interesting. The in-person groups have always been the more lively ones, as you can probably imagine, with some people giving us additional information to help add to the information that was just presented regarding income, et cetera, et cetera. Why don't you move to the next slide? Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, great. So who did we talk with, or what categories do they fall in? As you can see, we talked with folks with varying incomes. You see some sense of those people there. We also talked with people of varying household sizes. You'll see a fairly substantial group of not reported there. We intend to get that cleaned up. There were a lot of people who didn't complete, mostly with the online focus groups we did not complete the questions that we had asked of them, and we are following up with them. So we'll have, for the final report, a much more complete picture of who we talked with. But again, you can see that there was quite a diversity here of people that we spoke with in terms of income, household size. You know, you can see that there's a good number of folks that make over $100,000, but the vast majority of people we talked with were under the, or at least the biggest category of people we talked with were under the $50,000 mark, and some of them even told us that they're in the $20,000 to $30,000 range. So next slide. So this is a pie chart that shows the focus group participants, their vehicle age, and their weekly mileage driven. You know, I will point out that in terms of the vehicles, we specifically asked whether anyone in our 120, 130 person that was the total number of people we spoke with, the 16 focus groups. We asked whether anyone drove an EV, and interestingly enough, nobody did. So a lot of that I suspect has to do with income and maybe even geography to some extent. You know, the need maybe to have a vehicle that is a bit different than what you get the most get EVs in. At least the types of vehicles you get EVs, you find are EVs. It's important to also note that among the many people we spoke with, they were very explicit about the kinds of vehicles they drove. Not many folks had more than one vehicle. And of course, with the Disability Rights Washington people, nobody had a vehicle, but they did express the sorts of, they did indicate to us the sorts of vehicles that they usually ride in. So why don't we go to the next slide? So something that we found interesting, especially given the fact that both Linda Kennedy, who works with me, and myself we're very familiar with transportation, how transportation is funded, the gas tax, et cetera, et cetera. You know, most of the people we talked with were either unfamiliar or, you know, they just didn't respond when we asked the question, how are roads paid for in the state? For the people that were familiar, even in some cases, they were wrong. Some people talked about the fact that tolls fund most of the roads in the state, car tabs. A few people talked about taxes, but it was kind of interesting how people were kind of all over the board, which to us indicated there's a need for additional education on that score. So next slide. And this slide kind of goes with the previous slide about not knowing how roads are funded. What do you pay yearly in gas tax? I don't want to say that we had a lot of fun with that, but we did discover that people were kind of all over the board, most of them thinking that they paid a lot more in gas tax than they do. And in fact, in some cases, people pulled out their calculators and calculated, thought they calculated what they paid. And one particular individual was pretty obstinate and insisted that he pays $5,000 a year in gas taxes, regardless of what we said and how we kind of tried to direct him in the right place. So let's go to the next slide. So our next steps, we are going to finish up a few focus groups, some areas that we didn't get to. One place we're going to be talking to people is in the professional driver community. A lot of especially East African and even some East Indian populations, they have significant numbers of people who drive vehicles for a living. We'll be talking with them and a few other people. We will be talking with several community leaders, and that information will be reflected in our final report. We also have a survey that's ready to go out, and we're hoping to get it out soon. It pretty much asks the same questions we asked in the focus groups. Our intent will also be, as I mentioned previously, to reach out to focus group participants that did not complete the questions or answer the questions that we asked previously. I'll end by saying that this group that we talked with was very, I mean, they may have been a little reluctant when we first started to give out a lot of information, but as we got into it, they seemed to be very interested in giving their perspective. And many said that they have never been asked their perspective in the past. And commensurate to that, all of them, with the exception of one individual who made it very clear he did not want to participate in the future. But everybody else said, yes, they would be willing to participate in the future. And as part of our pilot program participation next year, we'll be reaching out to those people. So that's all I have. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Tom.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. So I'm just wanted to make sure I understood. I thought we just went through some graphs that showed that RUC was a almost non-measurable difference between the gas tax, you know, when we look at low income versus higher incomes. So what is the goal of these focus groups now that we're kind of said RUC versus gas tax really doesn't have a measurable difference, but now we're still continuing to survey and focus and measure focus groups. I'm just, what's the end game?
So Travis or Allegra, you may want to answer that, but I can begin by saying that we got a lot of additional information from these people that we spoke with. You'll see a lot of that in our final report, but I would point out that there were many suggestions for pilot programs, ways to reduce the impact on low-income communities. Each one of the focus groups that we went to indicated that there ought to be some relief for lower income populations. And they provided, I don't know, 10 or 15 different suggestions for how that might happen. And you'll be seeing some of those, I know, and some of them will be featured in the pilot program. And they had other comments to make about, their how they drive, where they drive, and what sorts of impediments or opportunities they might find in a rut.
I would just add that the ability to pay is one consideration, but we have a number of other considerations we want to think about as we contemplate what a policy rollout might look like. So, language, access, both in terms of just sort of understanding what's the new system, how does it work, where do I sign up, how does it, am I using an odometer reading, am I using something else? So there are a number of dimensions that we're looking for feedback on. I would also say that while the very specific question of there isn't a difference between road usage charge and gas tax, doesn't mean that it's not difficult for people to pay either of those things. Just that as contemplated right now, there would not be a large difference between what they pay in the gas tax. But we know there are probably people who are struggling to pay the gas tax currently.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Senator Fortunato? You're on mute.
Yes, yeah, thank you. If you recall way back, one of the graphs in one of the presentations looked at the transportation section of the amount of money that lower income people paid, and they paid a larger portion of their money in transportation. But what we're really looking at is trying to come up with some way of helping lower income people in their entire budget. I mean, what we're focused on here is just, let's try to manipulate this RUC charge to try to make up for the difference and all that stuff. And, I had a bill, that said, let's exempt prepared food and clothes. Everybody needs food, everybody needs clothes. And when you look at lower income people, for example, if you just exempted prepared food, 87% of that money would go to lower income people. That puts more money into their household budget. So I think we're looking at a little confined area here, trying to compare that with just this RUC and try to manipulate these things. And it's obviously pretty complex to try to do that. The object is to provide more money to a lower income family's household budget. So I think we ought to perhaps even just put a line in there somewhere that we should be looking at some other, a broader approach rather than confine it just to gas tax and RUC.
Yeah, point taken in terms of the impact to lower income households. As we showed that, relief on the taxes paid for either fuel tax or road usage charge would be small compared to, bigger moves that the legislature could make to assist.
Right. So I would just like to see some reference to that, to broadening that out, to try to balance that, as opposed to just confining it just to transportation.
Any other questions? Doesn't seem so. Is that it?
I think I'm up next. Yeah. Thank you, Henry and team. Great presentation. I've got the next section on cost reduction. Before I started, I saw a question in the chat from Senator Saldana, and I apologize, I didn't see your hand up earlier, Senator. The question is about the back on the rate setting. What's the basis for RUC rates? To your question specifically, yes, almost all of the other RUC programs have been looking at per mile charging as a replacement. And so the rate setting is done on that basis. New Zealand's is a little bit different because they started with RUC for the vehicles that pay it. So they weren't replacing anything. They treat it as a forward-looking. They look forward and see what are the costs going to be over the next several years, estimate how many miles will be driven, and then divide those two numbers basically to get a per mile rate. And that gets updated every couple of years. So the next section is a recap of the cost reduction workshop series. And like the equity presentation, many of you participated in the spotlight session on this topic in late October, early November. So this is a briefer version of that. So just as a recap, on the next slide, you'll see what we did in this task. And Annalise, if you could kind of click through, this one's animated, but we started with some background research. Yep, there we go. To come up with a cost analysis framework, we generated a series of challenge statements that we wanted to use in convening a workshop for participants to work through some of the bigger cost issues of the road usage charging. And we invited partner agencies, specifically states that are doing road usage charging and the Department of Licensing to be involved so that we could get some insights from operators about how some of the solutions we might generate in the workshops could actually be applied. Then we had a series of 3 workshops earlier this fall. I think we started in August and wrapped up in October. Each workshop started with an orientation where we did a background briefing. We reviewed the challenge statement and the sort of operating rules, because we did all of these virtually with as many as 15 or 16 folks. So we had smaller breakout groups and tried to proceed the work with as much involvement from the voices we had around the table as possible. Each workshop lasted about a week, some were a little bit longer. And at the end, we presented the findings within the workshop, which has led to the report out that we gave at the spotlight session. What we were really trying to achieve in this workshop series was elements of policy as well as system design concepts that could be incorporated into a RUC program that would help with controlling the cost of collection and bringing it down to a more acceptable level. Those in turn are the basis of some of our concepts and recommendations for pilot testing that you'll hear about later in today's meeting. And all of those recommendations are meant to be applicable not only to Washington, but also to the other states that could be looking at RUC programs, including specifically those that participated with us in the workshop, as well as to the federal government. Next slide, please. So we had 3 topics that we wanted to focus in on. These were selected by the participating agencies: customer service, enforcement, and procurement and certification. So I'll talk through each one of those and some of the things we discovered during the workshop series. On the next slide, I think you'll see the list of agencies that participated. Of course, the Commission, the Department of Licensing, great participation from Origo, the Oregon DOT staff who have been operating that program for a number of years. And we had the Utah DOT take part in a couple of sessions as well. Next slide. A few quick assumptions. We assumed that were there to be manual mileage reporting for road usage charge system, that it would be based on self-reporting offered by the Department of Licensing. We assumed that if there were to be automated mileage reporting options through devices or apps, that would be offered by or with the support of vendors from the private sector. And that the ultimate responsibility for revenue collection, customer service, and oversight of any vendors would rest with the DOL. Next slide, please. First challenge statement was about customer service, which is to design a customer service center at a low cost of operations. See a hand up, Senator Fortunato.
Yes, thank you. If I do a manual reporting, let's say I report and my cost is $1. I do that manually, I think the collection cost at a dollar, let's just pick a number and say 3% or 5%. But what was the number that you were using for the third-party vendor? Because some of the numbers we were talking about were 25, 30, 35%. What was the percentage?
We didn't use a number in this exercise as a starting point. It's more of an output of some analysis and negotiation, frankly, that would have to be done with the private sector. Certainly it's more today, but it depends on the method that the private sector is offering. So if it's device-based, it's going to be presumably more expensive than if it's just a standalone app. If there's in-vehicle telematics involved, that the cost of that prospectively could be quite low, especially compared to the device approach. But I think in general terms, you could see the range in cost anywhere from a few dollars per vehicle all the way up to tens of dollars per vehicle for private sector administration. And again, it depends on the technology that they're offering, the cost of that technology. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if we go back, for example, well, let's say I pay my license tabs online and pay by credit card. Say, okay, you're paying by credit card, you got to pay 2.4% more money because of the collection fee. So if you report manually, you should pay a lower rate. And if you report with the unit that's costing 25% to collect, you should pay a higher rate. And so we need to look at that analysis. My big deal in all this is cost of collection. It's bad enough we're taking money out of people's pockets, but when we're taking that money and giving it 25% to a third-party vendor, that's way more egregious than, you know, hey, it's going to cost 2% or 3% to do the administrative. So we have numbers on that somewhere. I remember seeing that, but you could get a little more information on that. That would be great.
Yeah, I think the numbers you may be recalling were from the analysis we did several years ago, where we showed a manual system relative to an automated system with vendors, and the cost of the vendor approach was higher. I think it ranged on the low end 5% at scale up to I think 13 or 15% on the higher end. I can't remember exactly. We certainly have that in the archives, and we can go back and send it around for you all to review. I do agree.
One of the reasons I bring that up is because we just got done talking about lower income people and trying to adjust the mileage rate on that. Well, this sort of ties in with that. I mean, if I'm a higher income person and I don't want to be bothered with all this reporting and all that stuff, and I'm willing to pay an extra charge, $25 a month, whatever the heck it is, I'm willing to pay an extra charge for a third-party vendor to do the reporting for me, I'll go that route. I don't want to be bothered with this stuff. However, somebody at a lower income level would be saying, hey, this is a significant amount of money. If I do it manually, I could save X amount of dollars. So I would tend to look at the approach in that direction rather than just looking at the dollar amount or the per mileage account amount rather than what's the total cost of collection. How much money are we actually getting out of this is the thing, because if we start giving them credit, we're paying somebody else 25, 30%. I mean, calculating in my head, we're losing money.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Would you agree to make that a question instead of a statement?
Yes. That's what this work is all about, is trying to make it cheaper to collect. So preaching to the choir, Senator. So we took our first approach to look at the customer service element, which is one of the cost drivers, regardless of whether it's a manual approach or a technology approach with vendors. You can imagine there's probably going to be a lot more customer attention and service required the more you ask customers to do. So how can you deliver that customer service cost effectively? Next slide, please. We broke down the customer service aspect of RUC into what we called the customer journey. So you think about going from left to right, what is it like for a customer to experience a RUC system? Well, before they even go into the system, there's sort of this general awareness of it that comes through public education, news coverage, this sort of thing. Once the service begins, or the vehicle that they own is subject to a road usage charge, there is potentially an enrollment step, although enrollment itself could be either bypassed or simplified through mileage reporting manually. Then there's the mileage reporting step, invoicing and paying for the miles driven. And then we also have a post-service part of the journey when someone exits the system. Perhaps they leave the state, sell their vehicle, switch to a vehicle that's not subject to a road usage charge. So what does that handoff look like at the end of their journey? During the journey, the dark shaded area in the middle, there are a variety of elements of customer service provision that face the customer. These are the things the customer interacts with. So there could be in-person services, for example, at licensing offices, a call center, website, and even direct mail. All of these things in turn are connected to what we call backstage activities. These are things that are required to support customer service that the customer doesn't necessarily interact with directly. So this is the mileage collection system, data processing, count management, and the invoicing system. So a lot of elements to providing customer service, and through this workshop, we wanted to drill in and look at what are ways to configure it to be more cost effective, perhaps, than we have been in previous pilot tests. Next slide, please. In conversations, especially with DOL, and just wanted to again acknowledge DOL's and Jill, if she's on the line still, for their very proactive participation in all of these workshops, but especially in customer service. DOL already provides customer service, of course, a lot of lessons learned from that, both challenges, opportunities, and successes that we were able to draw on in thinking through some ways to layer in a road usage charge cost effectively. So we thought about it as, from the outset, as balancing. So on the one hand, there's customer satisfaction, wanting to, quote, wow the customer and provide them a good experience, educating them so that they know what they need to do, and keeping it simple so that they can complete their tasks quickly. On the flip side, there's operational efficiency. What wows the customer may not be simple and easy for the agency to administer, although in some cases there are synergies there where those two things do overlap. And you want to be able to establish the boundaries for customer service and monitor how you're performing and measure the performance of customer service as well as the cost of it. So we kept these factors in mind as we went through the workshop. Next slide. A few common threads throughout our discussions. First was the importance of getting to know your customer and, quote, meeting them where they are. And sometimes we meant that literally. And there are some opportunities we'll talk about for pilot testing that came out of that discussion. We talked about the importance of deploying targeted or customized support, especially in the early years of the new program, to build comfort and familiarity and trust with customers. Third was offering alternatives for drivers, for owners of vehicles who find themselves in different circumstances, who have different preferences about how to report miles, how to pay, where to pay. And then finally, customizing how issues are addressed so that when there are challenges that customers are facing, they have a place to go and can get their issues resolved quickly. A gap that we identified at the end of the workshop was the notion of managing customer changes. You can think about when you need to change your email address or your mailing address or your credit card on file. We've all had this experience where you try to do something simple, something in your life has changed and you need to tell someone you have an account with about it. And that sometimes can sort of lead to an unraveling of the customer experience as you go to complete what you believe is a fairly simple task, but the system on the other end just doesn't want to accept your change easily. So thinking through what those changes could be in a RUC system and how we might anticipate that through system design. Next slide, please. Then the second workshop was on procurement and certification. The idea here was to design a procurement and certification process for RUC vendors with a market contract accessible by multiple states through service level agreements. A lot of jargon there. The bottom line is we're looking at how can we make it easier for vendors, if we're going to have them, to do business with the state? And how can we make it easier for states to work with vendors, to hire vendors, and to design systems that vendors are going to be building. Next slide, please. There's a spectrum that you can think about of procurement possibilities, ranging from, on the left, full government provision of the service. So this would be in-house provision of the mileage collection, the invoicing, the customer support, the fee collection, account, all of the elements of the RUC system fully provided by a government agency. And all the way on the right end of the spectrum is the notion of an open market, where you invite qualified vendors to provide all of these functions, customer service, fee collection, and so forth, certified by government as fit to be able to provide those services. And then there's several sort of variations on these two extremes within the spectrum. So in the middle, you have the possibility of contracting the RUC functions to a single vendor. We call that competition for the market. You could contract to multiple qualified vendors. We call that competition in the market. So you can see where the current programs shake out along this spectrum. New Zealand is an open market for qualified vendors. Oregon is moving in that direction. They have 2 commercial account managers that are qualified, but they also have a state account manager. So customers can choose whether to work with a private vendor or with the state. Next slide, please. Elements of a market contract. So the notion here would be that the state or states could produce a boilerplate contract, basically, that could be used for RUC service providers or vendors. And so we thought through in this workshop, what would that contract look like? What would the terms of it be? What features would it have in common? What would the standard terms be? What would be some of the key differences that states would want to work out on their own as opposed to all in common? So we sketched out what those elements would be, and one of the activities for our continued research is to actually come up with a market contract boilerplate that could be used by a number of different states. And the benefit of this is that when you're thinking about a government agency procuring services, if they have a model that they can go to, similar to the model privacy policy that was developed a couple of years ago, if they have a model they can look to, it becomes easier and faster to actually go to market and find the pieces of the puzzle that you need to build a RUC system. Next slide, please. We also designed a framework for multi-state certification. So the idea here is that if you had RUC vendors in an open system, you wouldn't necessarily want those vendors to have to be certified or compete state after state after state. That makes their cost of doing business higher. And then you actually repeat the costs on the state side as well each time you do it. So there are elements that could be certified, certainly the mileage reporting technologies and account management and customer service systems. There are also existing standards that can be leveraged that exist already in the marketplace. So having a multi-state framework that draws on these elements can reduce the cost of vendor participation in the market, and bringing their costs down makes it cheaper for the state. Next slide. Lastly, what are those elements to certify? We broke this down into some more detail. Mileage reporting technologies includes everything from the devices to the way those devices communicate with an account management system. Within the account management system, how are the transactions processed? What are the payment options? And then on the customer service side, what are the processes for handling customer requests? What type of reporting capabilities do vendors need? And what type of training are they doing with customer service agents to make sure that the content and quality and frequency of that training is consistent? So the third and final workshop on the next slide is enforcement. Oh, sorry, one more. We have this is a list of external standards to leverage that we talked through that could be brought into a certification process. And again, the benefit of this is that these standards exist in the marketplace already, so states can point to these external standards that vendors qualified need to meet, which again reduces the cost of doing business. Next slide. Last on enforcement, we know that enforcement is an unexplored area with road usage charging, potentially with a manual reporting method tied to vehicle registration. A lot of that can be avoided. Nevertheless, wanted to understand what are the trade-offs of capturing a relatively high percentage of the revenues that are due and doing it in a way that encourages compliance without having to resort to hard enforcement. So on the next slide, we sketched out the spectrum of compliance, ranging from folks who are voluntarily compliant at the top to those who are intentionally non-compliant, cheating or evading or committing fraud at the bottom. But there's actually a shading of degrees of non-compliance in between. There may be short-term unintentionally non-compliant. I forgot, or I was late, or I was out of town, or I was in the hospital. There may be long-term unintentional non-compliance. I moved away for 6 months. Then there's long-term intentional non-compliance, and the notion of good reasons and not good reasons is probably not necessarily something that can be codified into law. But if you think about the experiences that individuals have, maybe I'm non-compliant for the reason that I was incarcerated, or I literally did not have the funds to pay, but I needed my vehicle. So understanding what the circumstances are that folks find themselves in, and creating not just enforcement, but creating systems that encourage voluntary compliance. The idea is that we move folks to the top category here to the extent possible through system design and customer service, and reserve hard enforcement for those who truly need it, which are the bottom ones. Next one. So some strategies for maximizing voluntary compliance, which is where we took this workshop. Design of a simple, coherent system that makes it easy for folks to pay, that uses language that is simple, has eye-catching reminders. It's not difficult for folks to understand or abrasive. Use the concept of coaxing, which is the idea of working constructively with those folks who are non-compliant for, quote, good reasons, using kind language, letters, and avoiding shaming. Next slide, some more strategies. Payment plans, the possibility of offering the ability to pay over time for those who struggle to pay all at once, as well as grace periods. And finally, incentives. And this has to be done carefully because you don't want to undermine revenue, which is the fundamental purpose of the system in the first place, but using incentives to reward good behavior in the first place, which means paying on time. Next slide. Next steps. So we've done quite a bit of work through the workshops. We have a few pilot ideas that were generated through these workshops that we'll hear about later this afternoon. But the report out from this research task will be done in the first quarter of next year. It will include a summary of the public policy elements that are recommended, as well as system design concepts to carry forward into next year. And again, you'll hear about those later this afternoon. So I believe with that, we either have a break or another presentation, but I'll pause and see if there are any questions. Representative Orcutt.
Thanks, Travis. I'm looking back at slide 74. Your lower right-hand box talks about contract duration. It can be fixed with renewals or open-ended. And then you've got the termination and defining the exit clauses and all of that. Do you have a sense for the cost to the state and the problems for all of the registered drivers if we had to move from one vendor to another?
Good question. We've certainly seen that in the tolling world. Often be a costly transition when you move from one vendor to another. That's one of the challenges, especially in a competition for the market situation where you have only one vendor that provides the service. So the state is in a sense vulnerable to that one vendor, as opposed to having multiple vendors that can provide a similar service. If there's one that drops out or suddenly becomes unable to perform, it's a matter of transitioning customers from one vendor to another, which in the way the open market system has been designed for RUC, the option of using a vendor is on the customer. So you basically can alert them to the need to choose a new vendor if that becomes the case, as opposed to when you have a single contract with them. Regardless, though, it is a challenge, it's a risk, and it is costly, more costly when you're reliant on one vendor than when you have multiple vendors.
So the impact to the driver, to the registered owner of the vehicle, what happens to them? What do they have to go through if we do change vendors?
Right. Well, I suppose if you had only one vendor, there would need to be a transition period on the back end first to set up for a transition on the front end with the customer, which would then involve communicating with the customer that the entity that they're interacting with is changing, that they need to be prepared for. And then, I mean, I could imagine designing this smoothly. I could imagine if there wasn't an anticipation of this, if it wasn't well designed, it could be very uncomfortable, but the smoothest possible way to do it would probably be to alert the customer of the change and provide them with the mileage reporting opportunities and invoicing on the same cycle that they had been doing it previously during the transition, so that the only thing that changed in their experience would be the name on the email. That way you don't lose any transactions or lose any customers. But that's the best case scenario. So that's the type of thing that should be anticipated when you have a single vendor situation. When you're at the beginning, when you're writing the contract, to make sure that the first contractor is aware and responsible for helping through a transition like that. The good news is you're collecting mileage data on a periodic basis, so you can't really lose miles. You can just catch up when you capture the odometer reading or the mileage total at the next transaction point. So I guess in a sense, compared to the tolling model, it's a lot easier to have that type of a transition, because it's not like drivers are making transactions every single day. They could be making transactions as infrequently as once a year. So that's a lot easier to manage.
Any other questions? Okay, this is a good time to break for lunch. Before we do, I need to remind everybody to stay logged in. Turn off your video and microphones for the lunch break. It's now 12:13. Let's resume promptly at 12:45. So it's now 12:45. Let's go ahead and reconvene. Our first presentation after lunch will be from Baxter, who will give us an innovation update. Take it away, Baxter.
Thank you, Roy. So Rashini Durand has typically been given updates on the innovation task, but she is out on vacation this week, so I'll be filling in for her. Can we move ahead to the next slide, please? So the objective of the RUC innovation task was to not only update existing mileage reporting methods with recent technology improvements, but also take a broader view at the entire RUC process and how each step in the process might be improved in terms of equity, cost reduction, and user experience. And the innovation task ran concurrently with the equity and cost reduction tasks. And the intent here was to closely coordinate so that we can ensure that mileage reporting methods we devise can support equity and cost reduction objectives. Next slide, please. So initially, the research had a fairly narrow focus on technology and mileage reporting, but we wanted to look beyond technology at the RUC process more holistically to identify best practices from across the RUC industry and in other sectors like utilities, insurance, tolling, financial technology companies, all while considering cost reduction, systems and operations equity, and user experience aspects. And then we identified opportunities for improvements across the RUC process that will benefit states and end users. Yeah, we can skip ahead to the next one. Thank you. So for the past year, we've been doing this RUC innovation research and industry outreach, the culmination of which is a series of pilot concepts that's going to take this research further. And the research we've been doing has really laid the groundwork for these pilot concepts that I'll touch on in a moment, but Jingjing is going to describe in more detail in the next section coming up. And the industry outreach has led it to interest from outside players who might be able to help with the design of some of these pilot concepts. Next slide, please. So previous RUC pilots have been larger scale efforts that tested the feasibility of a RUC system and gauged public acceptance of RUC in Washington. But these forward drive pilots are smaller scale, more focused subtests that address issues uncovered in the first pilot stage and take a deeper dive into specific points in the RUC process, always with equity, cost reduction, and user experience as the guiding principles. Next slide, please. And these subtests focus specifically on equity, user choice, user experience, and cost reduction. We wanted these policy priorities to frame our research effort and answer the question, how can we support fair and accessible ways of collecting RUC in a way that is cost efficient for the state and does not impose an undue burden on the end user? In the first pilot, we looked at equity essentially from the user pays principle, but of course there are multiple dimensions to equity to consider, including simplicity, accessibility, ease of compliance. So when it comes to user choice, we have considered more than just providing options to report mileage. We also consider account management options, including communication options and payment options. It's not always about providing unlimited choice, as this can be overwhelming and certainly isn't cost efficient. Rather, it will be a matter of balancing equity and cost reduction and user experience considerations to come up with the most relevant options for various categories of users. The user experience is related to the equity aspect. We explored ways to provide a simple, convenient, transparent experience to promote understanding and compliance. The goal here is not only to ease the pain, but provide as positive experience as possible, all while finding techniques to reduce the cost of RUC collection. This includes running more efficient processes by leveraging recent technology, but also opening it up to more business models that can support RUC efficiently. Next slide, please. So the research consisted of 3 steps. The first was to break down RUC into each of its core functions or steps. The second was to identify new mileage reporting and payment choices for vehicles with different levels of connectivity, ranging from no connectivity, third-party connectivity to native connectivity, and for drivers with different reporting preferences, ranging from fully automated to fully assisted. And finally, we identified public and private sector partners that may be able to support or enhance RUC. Next slide, please. One of the key research outcomes was identifying reporting choices, and through conversations with outside players like mobility as a service platform providers, vehicle registry system operators, data aggregators, retail partners, we developed a list of players that can help provide more reporting options. And we've identified opportunities for service improvements at various points throughout the RUC process and plan to test these with a series of subpilots. We can skip ahead to 92. Thank you. The idea is to design a RUC service that is both easy and cost efficient to administer, but also supports a positive user experience and addresses systems and operational equity. So in these sub-pilots, we consider the full RUC process from different user perspectives, identify pain points along that journey for administrators and end users, and design potential solutions and test those solutions. So we've mapped out different points throughout the process where systems or processes may be improved. And again, Jingjing is going to describe these in a little more detail coming up in a moment, but a couple examples include, go ahead to the next one, please. Testing and service improvements based on the simplest, most cost-effective RUC service possible, centered around self-reported mileage and payment cycles tied to an existing annual process, such as registration renewal. Next slide, please. Piloting RUC service improvements based on more choices for reporting mileage and paying invoices. Next, please. RUC service improvements that specifically address the payment pain point. RUC service improvements based on mileage collection through native automaker telematics, researching the reliability of data collected through telematics services, as well as the end user experience while reporting through native telematics. And targeted discounts, vehicle transaction research, manual mileage exemptions, alternative invoice designs, and unregistered vehicle research. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Jingjing, and she's going to detail each one of these pilot concepts for us.
Thank you so much, Baxter. So I know we've been giving a little bit of an update on the demonstrations and the mini pilots through the spotlights. And this morning, or afternoon now, we're excited to present to you the suite of the subtests that are starting to take shape. These subtests directly address the 3 priorities that were identified for the mini pilots. These include equity, cost effectiveness, and user experience. Next slide. So many of these concepts surfaced over the last year of analysis, outreach, research, and workshops. Many of the, we have taken the top 10 ideas and really tried to put some information around them. These are the ones that seem to address these priorities the best. And so on this slide, we show the main drivers behind each of the concepts. However, all of the concepts will be assessed against these three objectives. The pilots are different in nature. Some are more like prototypes, where the focus is as much on building and testing an instance of the system as it is on testing the prototype with users. Prototyping will provide great insights into how will this work, even before getting to the how well does this work piece of the question in the stage. The pilot type tests will focus a little bit more on how well is this working with different users. So as you can see, many of these are prototypes first and then followed by piloting. The field research type of mini pilots will focus more on collecting data that currently doesn't exist today. So this will inform the overall RUC program design. These are some questions that have been open, which we may have looked at it quantitatively up to this point, but we want to try to drill down and get some more specifics with the data. And then the final type that we have are simulations. So simulations run as closely as possible to the real thing so that we can see what eventually comes out of the process. So it's not super important what each of these types are as we move forward, but just wanted to give a flavor of what we're looking and what we're calling pilots, because they do look and sound a little bit different, but ultimately the idea is to just better understand options and choices that are going to be offered to customers. So I'll present an overview of all 10 concepts today. Over the next few months, what we'll do is the team will develop the 10 into fuller pilot plans with implementation details, resources required, timelines, and also take a look at how to balance the amount of effort and kind of the cost benefit of investing in all 10 of these pilots. Okay, next slide. The key mini pilot, this is a centerpiece in the gray. Number 1 is the self-reporting tab renewal method based on road usage charge. This concept is based on the current tab renewal process, where vehicle owners receive a reminder in the mail that their tab is due, and they could go online or go to a sub-agent and pay their vehicle registration fee. The reminder itself presents the vehicle owner with the breakdown of the fees owed, options for donations and payment methods today. So this concept basically leverages this annual process that is in place and to collect road usage charge. So to do so, the users would be asked to type in their odometer reading as part of the process. The road usage charge would be calculated and paid with the other vehicle fees. This is not dissimilar to our income taxes, the self-reporting concept. In this case, odometer readings could be audited randomly, or if deemed necessary, it could be audited in a smart method where there was some reason to believe auditing was necessary. Compared to requiring odometer photo and plug-in devices, this is a relatively convenient and low-cost method for collecting road usage charge that could work for a majority of people. So with the self-reporting tab renewal-based road usage charge at the very core of all of these of the pilots, we're also looking at building 6 more mini pilots. So those are the ones that you can see connected with the dotted lines there. So let's see, the number 2, that's the one to pilot flexible payment plans. Number 3 is the enhanced road usage charge mileage reporting methods, options that would offer previously tested mileage reporting options such as odometer photo or plug-in devices, in addition to the self-reporting method. Number 4 is to test new mileage reporting methods, specifically native telematics. And then sorry, I'm losing track of my numbers. Number 5 is to test out-of-state mileage exemptions. And then another pilot will look at providing income-based discounts. 3 of the mini pilots are not directly related to the self-reporting tab renewal-based road usage charge. These are the number 8 unregistered vehicle research that will shed more light on how many vehicles are driving around simply late on their tab payments versus chronically not registered, which I think Travis mentioned earlier. So this is vehicle transaction. This is understanding the ones that may cause a little bit more problems if we had more dependency on the revenue on vehicle registrations. And then number 9 is vehicle transactions research, which will seek to identify other complementary vehicle related transactions that a vehicle owner completes throughout the year. And then 10 is to set up and conduct a mock road usage charge standards committee in line with the idea that came out of a lot of the cost collection results about trying to come up with something that is maybe certifiable or standard across states. Okay, I'm going to move to the first one, the first mini pilot on the next slide, the self-reporting and tab renewal-based road usage charge. So I'll walk through each of the 10 mini pilots. This self-reporting tab renewal-based road usage charge is a potential game changer for RUC. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this one. As I described before, a customer would receive your annual tab renewal reminder by mail. And then when they go to pay online or at the sub-agent, they would enter in their current odometer reading. Their road usage charge could be calculated right there on the spot and included as part of the vehicle fees due with the tabs, and the person can pay for it all in one transaction. By including road usage charge right into the tab renewal process, users are already familiar with today. There is no separate process for users to learn about, simply just about the concept of road usage charge, preferably, there's outreach done before they walk in, but no enrollment is needed. There's no bill to remember to pay for. There's no login and password to forget. So this seems to be a potentially much more convenient method of reaching out to people with something new like a Rook program. There's no device that needs to be installed, no app that needs to be downloaded. Administratively, if this concept could leverage the existing account management system, then there's no syncing of multiple devices, no consumer technology hardware or software to provide, distribute, or provide customer service for. So this is a really novel approach. There are no pilots that have integrated their tab renewal process and allow self-reporting for road usage charge. However, states are hearing about the findings from, for example, Hawaii's pilot, which revealed a relatively high level of public acceptance for road usage charge and a strong preference for using their annual safety inspections as paying and then paying right along with their vehicle registration process. Cost estimates in the Hawaii pilot showed that administrative costs are possibly a quarter of that of implementing a third-party account managed system that may not be completely extendable to other states, given that Hawaii also doesn't have the volume that's needed. But there is a significant cost savings that could be kind of simulated or achieved. So that's compared to a third-party account management system using high-tech mileage reporting methods. So although Washington does not have a safety inspection, this mini pilot aims to prototype a system that offers to drivers that same level of user familiarity, convenience, and then also achieve some of those potential cost savings. In Hawaii, a statewide survey of those that were introduced to road usage charge, almost 50% supported a road usage charge because they were already familiar with the process. It didn't seem overly invasive. 50% of respondents preferred paying annually, and 87% of respondents preferred reporting using their annual safety check. So this is just some ideas of what we're looking at here by introducing this mini pilot. So there's still a lot to flesh out with this concept. The pilot will begin with creating a simulation of the existing tab renewal interface and determining if there are alternative options for integrating road usage charge, mileage reporting, calculation, and payment into the process. The team will spend time designing the process as intuitively as possible for the various tab renewal channels. And then most importantly, an intuitive process can greatly reduce one of the largest cost drivers of operations, which is labor to provide customer service. The goal would be to minimize the number of additional customer service calls that are produced due to road usage charge and to streamline the process so that the transaction time for each tab renewal is minimally impacted. So we have listed some preliminary metrics for each of the mini pilots. On this slide, you can see that for this self-reporting tab renewal based Rook pilot, these include an estimated cost per Rook transaction or cost per dollar collected, customer satisfaction, and ease of completion and ease of compliance. On the next slide, we show a high-level overview of what the mini pilot would consist of. This pilot would begin with confirming DOL processes and operating constraints and preferences that would factor into ways that a RUC could be integrated into the tab renewal process. The team will then design one or more RUC reporting and payment process flows and validate and refine it with DOL. After that, the team will determine methods for prototyping the process flows using methods like tabletop exercises, development of templates, and website mockups. A lot will be learned through the process of simply developing and improving the prototypes. And once the optimal prototypes have been developed, the team will test the prototypes with DOL management, subagents, and end users. So observing how these users interface with the prototypes, how they navigate the process, the questions that they have, and the understanding that they get and the feedback will allow the team to see how well this process is understood, and gauge the potential impact on existing tab renewal processes. Our current estimate is that we will test the process with 5 to 10 DOL subagents and 50 to 100 drivers, and we expect this pilot to take about 5 to 7 months. So the next 6 pilots will build upon this base pilot. So I'm going to take a breath here and take any questions that anybody may have about this particular self-reporting tab renewal based RUC. All right, Representative Orchid.
Thank you. So you gave us some data on Hawaii's pilot and how popular it was. But I'm not familiar with Hawaii's gas tax to know how much of a differential it was. You know, is it going to be a similar differential for their people to do it on an annual basis as it would for folks in Washington, or is that a smaller amount, greater amount? How is that going to compare with our state?
Absolutely. The numbers that I presented weren't so much about, I guess, I'm not sure I'd call RUC popular anywhere. But however, in Hawaii, the rates were set similar to in Washington. So the state gas tax comes out to just a little under 1 cent per mile, but here we also have a county gas tax, which is about the same. So in most of the users would see a 2 cent per mile gas tax replacement, or sorry, 2 cents per mile road usage charge to replace their gas tax. So again, I wouldn't necessarily extend the results, you know, 1 for 1 from Hawaii to Washington. But I think what we did see is that out of the gate, Hawaii had a high, relatively high public acceptance rate. And we think that part of that is because of the fact that the process that was proposed here is something that people are already familiar with. They less concerns with privacy and also just the convenience factor. So we're hoping to capture some of that using this this concept of the self-reporting tab renewal RUC. Okay, so, sorry. Yes,
Kurt,
Trav.
Kurt has his hand up.
One thing that's kind of unique about Hawaii too, compared to most states, they actually have an annual vehicle inspection program. So people are very accustomed to having their mileage checked every year in the vehicle. It is a slightly different scenario than most places.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Kurt. And that's the reason I say it's not completely extendable to Washington. We're just hoping to learn from Hawaii in terms of maybe the tab renewal process is something people are already familiar with, and maybe some of that familiarity will help with implementing a new program.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't see any other hands raised and nothing in the chat, so I'm going to move on. So the next mini pilot is the flexible payment plans. So this mini pilot builds on the first one and adds on the flexible payment plans for customers that may require or we're dividing up their payments into smaller payments over the course of the year. As we heard earlier, the size of the payments may be the largest equity impact when moving from a gas tax to a road usage charge. So this is a topic that was discussed in the cost reduction workshops. Naturally, a lump sum payment is the lowest revenue risk for the state. The amount due is paid all at once. It's upfront when the customer is initially presented with the invoice. And the more the payments are split into additional payments, the more customer interface is needed to ensure payments are made. So at the bottom of the slide, other options out there that the research uncovered to date include wallet-based payments, where a private partner is contracted to manage a wallet from which funds are drawn to pay for a RUC, and the wallet is replenished on a regular basis. This is a method that is being used successfully in Oregon. Other options include flexible payment plans, similar to how property taxes are split up throughout the year, or flexible payment methods with interest rates. Our research showed that there are many flexible payment plans being offered out there by retail industry and other government agencies. However, the interest rates or late fees for retail are extremely high, which is not where we want to go with this. That's where a lot of times RUC may snowball, or those payment frequencies snowballs into larger and larger bills for those that are having trouble paying. So this mini pilot will look at not only integrating one or more payment plans to the process, but also to determine which payment plans are most useful for those that need it. And in addition to that, balancing that with the cost of providing these options. So ways to do this are to not offer payment plans to everyone. This is done by many government agencies where payment plans are offered only as needed or as requested, or when someone is expressed that they're having trouble paying bills. Or in other cases, incentivizing lump sum payments for those that have the ability to pay and might prefer the convenience of paying all at once and kind of nudging them towards that lump sum payment. The design concerns here are, do drivers that need a flexible payment plan find and are able to use it? Do they see value in it? When presented with a program, how many people would use a payment plan? And then what might the compliance rate be? What are the added costs of administration? We can go to the next slide. After the design phase, the plan is to recruit about 100 to 200 Washington drivers of various income levels with a focus on low-income volunteers. We would explain the pilot to the volunteers and present them with their RUC invoice through the self-reporting tab renewal interface. And to best simulate the challenge that low-income customers are facing, the pilot simulates this by providing volunteers reloadable gift cards that are preloaded with only a portion of the amount that they need to pay for their RUC at the beginning. These participants would be presented with flexible payment options, and they would choose their preferred payment programs along the way. Gift cards will be periodically reloaded throughout the pilot, and then surveys will be used to evaluate the effectiveness of the payment options and user experiences. Volunteers who complete all payments during the 6-month pilot will receive a reward at the end. The next pilot, we'll move on to the third one, is the enhanced RUC options. Although this is although we've identified the least costly method for RUC might potentially be through self-reporting, there are those that might prefer other options. For example, businesses. Fleets that have fleet management software already automatically collecting mileage on a daily basis might find manual self-reporting more convenient, or actually might find it more inconvenient, sorry. Additionally, those that drive a lot of miles out of state or non-public roads may prefer to report actual mileage driven in Washington, as we saw in the original WARUC pilot. So this mini pilot looks to offer these options within the tab renewal process. However, these other options may be administratively more expensive, particularly when it comes to the options with devices that are involved, since that would require third-party entities to support them. So again, the design of this mini pilot will aim to encourage users to choose the self-reporting method and then observe the percentage of users that still opt for enhanced services. Understanding these factors that drive consumers to choose more advanced reporting options can help to determine cost-sharing models that could be offered. So how essential is it for the state to offer these options? Can the state simply offer a reporting interface for any third party to provide mileage data so that these options can be offered, but wholly and independently by third parties without much state oversight and cost to the state, maybe through like an interface, data interface? Should the customer that selects these methods be responsible for the cost of the devices and operating costs, or should that cost be split between the state and the customer? If these other options must be offered, what is the cost per transaction? What percentage of people will choose them? And how can then they be designed to achieve the same high level of customer satisfaction and compliance rates without being confusing? The next step for this pilot is to design and develop the enhanced services to be offered, and then integrate the options into the tab renewal prototype design once it's available. We can go to the next slide. We're looking at about 200 volunteers in addition to those recruited in other pilots, and these volunteers will be presented with the tab renewal process with the enhanced options available. And the project team will observe the volunteers' choices and survey them about why they made these choices. Okay, move on to the next one is the native automatic telematics-based RUC. Then this pilot is an extension of this last one that I just described, the last mini pilot with enhanced options. The mileage reporting method that seems to hold a lot of promise, but where progress has been a little bit slower than hoped, is with native telematics. This option is becoming more real as automakers are beginning to participate in some of the RUC discussions. This mini pilot will take the volunteers that chose the native telematics in the mini pilot 3 and have them participate in a 3-month pilot. In the long term, the native automatic automaker telematics, oh, that's a mouthful, based method is seen as having high potential to provide a seamless customer experience and ability to reduce the cost of collection. So this pilot will evaluate readiness of customers and the industry for telematics and also provide some initial data on cost per transaction. So on the next slide, we will be integrating with one or more native telematics through an aggregator, and then the team will test the performance of the system to design requirements and survey volunteers about their experience. All right, next slide. The 5th mini pilot will look at ways to provide out-of-state travel deductions that complements self-reporting. So the objectives are to ensure that it is fair and easy to understand for the user, it's low cost, and the cost benefit of offering and operating such deductions is in line with offering these options. Some possibilities are to offer Washington drivers the ability to say, no, I don't have any out-of-state miles, provide a standard deduction for out-of-state driving. This would not require any proof. It would be a small number of miles. We would need to figure out how many of miles would be roughly representative for a standard deduction, or provide an option for drivers to get a higher deduction, but provide evidence. So this evidence could be gas tax or gas receipts, or could range all the way to, for example, plug-in devices with GPS. Other options, for example, we discussed some of the fleet management options, providing some sort of proof that the miles were driven or the gas was purchased out of state. So the metrics for this pilot is technical feasibility. How difficult is it to manage different streams of deductions, and how many people choose this option to report all of the miles that they drove out of state. And then is it possible to provide a good user experience, and what is the cost of providing this additional method in addition to self-reporting, especially if the self-reporting is the base method of reporting. Next slide. So what we will do in this is to investigate what the standard deduction options are, outline those programs, and then include possibilities for varying by location and other factors. For example, the areas that are near borders, maybe there are more options available, or a higher standard deduction is available for those cities and drivers. We'll evaluate the alternatives for accepting evidence to see how much work it is. There are some states that do actually take gas tax receipts for deductions. And so talking and interviewing some of those states, taking a look at the technology-based versus manual trip reports, and then take a look at the market sizing to see what is the benefit and cost at an individual level. So how many people find it worthwhile to submit this type of evidence? And so that they choose this evidence, and then taking a look at the cost and revenue impacts. In the design phase, we'll take a look at the prototype and design an out-of-state travel deduction program and test it with users, see what they think of it, talk to them with their interviews, and also look at operational cost of this. We'll take a look at about 100 drivers, particularly those near state borders. And then we expect this prototyping phase to last 6 months. Next, thank you. All right, the mini pilot number 6 is the targeted income-based discounts. So the goal of this pilot is to demonstrate how we can look at income-based discounts to the per mile rate in Washington. So this is to take a look at, is there a way to integrate a low-cost, user-friendly experience for customers to simulate the steps in receiving a discount. So the entire process hopefully wouldn't be something from scratch or new. We're looking at maybe something that would be compatible with existing programs of identifying those that would qualify for discounts possibly using other programs that exist out there, and extending those same type of benefits to those same individuals. We would take a look at the benefit cost of a discount. And then right now we're looking at DSHS data, which seems to be able to be reliable for identifying low-income individuals, and see if it's this data or this process is compatible with using that data. We'll take a look at customer satisfaction, include relative value to customer of the discount received, and take a look at the cost per transaction of offering such a program. Next. So this will require quite a bit of collaboration between DSHS and also with DOL in identifying the approach, and again, validating the approach, and taking a look at how this might actually map to DOL vehicle records. Based on that, we will design the prototype and then move on to the prototype testing phase. So again, this builds on the tab renewal process. We'll present customers that are part of this mini pilot only with a discount, and then walk through the additional steps required to do validation and verification of their low income status. And then basically we'll take a look similarly to the other ones, look at performance. In this case, we may do customer observation. So sometimes that means sitting next to them and walking through the process, looking at reactions, talking them through their thinking process so that we understand what specific things can be improved. For the larger volume of folks, that would be surveys to take a look at whether or not this satisfies low-income needs. We'll also take a look at cost of administering this discounts. We're looking at 100 drivers who qualify, and the development and design will probably take 3 to 5 months, and the pilot will be 2 to 3 months. Next. All right, so we've done a lot of work on alternative invoice designs, and we found from different pilots with different mileage reporting methods, with different vendors, the quality of the invoice is a really important aspect of communicating about road usage charge. If the user can't understand what they're paying for, how much they're charged, how that was calculated, and when there's maybe a credit received, or if this is a prepaid, postpaid, it can all get very confusing. One of the things we found in the WARUC initial pilot was that a lot of times we wanted to provide all the information all at once, so we provided it in a graph. People actually ended up getting a little bit more confused by some of the graphs, so they were taken out. So we think that a lot more can be invested in designing that invoice to get right down to the point of what is this road usage charge, especially when we get into maybe working with the tab renewal process. We want to make sure that we're not introducing additional confusion. So we want to basically create a range of invoice designs based on all of these mini pilot options that we're looking at, and make sure that all of that's communicated in as effectively as possible. So we'll take a look at kind of past invoice designs, some of the ones from other states that have been effective, and the feedback that has been received, and then try to achieve a higher level of clarity and simplicity for the end users. One of the big things is that if we can get users to understand at the very beginning what they're paying for, that actually increases the level of compliance. So if people kind of give up halfway in between, they don't come back, they decide it's too complicated, or the next time they come to pay this, I don't want to go through that. Then if they don't get a very easy compliance, they think they need to set aside a large amount of time to do this. Sometimes they end up not paying their bills on time. So some of the key assumptions we've made is that invoices might be able to take a different form depending on what program somebody is involved in or has signed up for, whether it's prepay, postpay, and then also based on the avenue that they want to pay. So if they have a preference for paying online, or if they want to come to DOL, maybe a slightly different information is presented to the user depending on where they want to interface. Metrics include level of understanding and user agreement with what they're seeing. If it's confusing and it looks like there's an error, that's definitely not good and creates more customer calls. Willingness to comply and the cost of complying. Next. So we'll basically look at a range of designs for the customer facing materials, including everything beginning from reminders to statements to invoices, and also how they're integrated into the process, whether that be through the website or through the reminders themselves, or it could be a separate, in some states, they actually have a separate portal you can go to look up what your invoice is with more detail. We'll prototype these invoices at appropriate points within the transaction process, and then again, observations and surveys to get customer feedback, and then make continuous improvements and do 2 to 3 cycles of this to see if we're able to get more easy to understand and clear invoice designs. We're looking at about 100 drivers statewide. The design will take about 2 months and prototype testing 2 to 3 months. All right, number 8 is the unregistered vehicle research. So this is the one where we're starting to move away from that tab renewal process, and we're looking at how many vehicles are driving around unregistered. And particularly, it's not as concerning to road usage charge if these vehicles are just a few days or maybe even a month late and they're catching up on their vehicle registration. However, if a lot of vehicles are driving around kind of long-term unregistered, that actually could impact in the revenue. So we'll take a look at the duration and also try to drill down deeper into the cause of vehicle registration lapses through this. So first of all, we'll take a look at quantifying the extent and duration of lapses in vehicle registration. This has been studied in other states where they were looking at vehicle emissions, and they found that they could actually take a look at pictures, go around and survey vehicles and tabs and see, okay, how many vehicles in a parking lot, which signifies that the vehicles actively being used on the roads are actually unregistered. So take a picture or write down, survey all of the vehicles in a parking lot in an area, look them up in the vehicle registry and say, okay, it's currently registered or unregistered, and then go back in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months to see, is it now registered and active, or is it still not registered? Start taking a look at this across the state could help us get an understanding of, is unregistration an issue that's equally spread out across the state? Are there particular areas where you're seeing more of this, less of this, and then start drilling down into why that is? Oh, Chair Jennings.
Are we going to be looking at vehicles that are registered out of state and are currently parked living here in the state of Washington for long periods of time?
Absolutely. That is definitely one thing we can look at because what the idea is to basically survey communities, and we can look at particularly bordering states or even, across the state, not only which vehicles are registered and look them up in the Washington DOL, but also take a note at exactly through that same process, how many are registered out of state. Now, we may not be able to look up their vehicle registration status out of state, but we can identify the numbers and quantities and frequency that we're seeing, see if that is consistent across the state, if there's particular areas where it is happening more than others. And then on top of that, we can also look at best practices, maybe across the state or with compared to other states that deal with the same issue, and see if Washington is implementing some of those best practices to try to encourage updating registrations, particularly if people have moved permanently to Washington.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so the last objective of this mini pilot is to increase compliant rates, reduce costs, and increase the net revenue. Quantifying all of this will help better understand if there's any areas where changes can be made. So the idea is here, there's some key assumptions based on some preliminary research that has been done that most unregistered vehicles eventually do renew. So if you just take a look at a single point in time in the vehicle registry, you'll see a certain percentage of vehicles that are unregistered at any one time. But if you look at vehicle registrations across over time, the actual number of vehicle registry vehicles that are not registered for a long time is actually much lower. We'd like to see how much that is. And then also, there's an assumption that most vehicle owners want to be compliant. Now we just need to drill down further into how can we make that process a little bit easier. Okay, next slide. So this is an extensive data collection process. So we will determine the data collection plan and methods and detail that further over the next few months and the analytical approach that will go with it. Then there's going to be a phase of 6 months where we're collecting the field data across the state. And then we'll also take a look at, then we have to compare that over time. And so take a look at, a snapshot, and then how does that change over time as is our vehicle registrations being resolved when they're late in the long run. And then we'll go into the evaluation phase and evaluate data for unregistered vehicle trends, such as the geography, vehicle age, fees. And then we'll start to survey Washington drivers about their vehicle registration status. And then hopefully we can identify those that are lapsed for a period of time, and then also interview them to better understand what are the things that are causing the lapses. Are there ways that we can help them become more compliant? The idea is to make sure that we're representing the entire state, so including urban areas, rural areas, eastern, central, western, and border areas. Once this data collection method is actually developed, it is something that could be used in the long run to kind of monitor the process and vehicle registration status around the state. So hopefully we'll design it in a way that it could be used to spot test or measure to see once, certain best practices, if they're implemented, if that actually helps to improve vehicle registration rates. All right, next slide. The next mini pilot is the vehicle transactions research. So this is, again, outside of the tab renewal process, looking at all the different places that people do vehicle transactions. So just as we've looked at, mileage reporting methods have changed over time, technology has changed. New business models, opportunities are continually arising. Some of the ones we've talked about over the last few months are, for example, vehicle VIN lookup services, where we're looking for, my family's looking for a new car, and we just typed in a VIN into Carfax, and we were able to see, okay, when was the last time the vehicle had an oil change? What was the odometer reading? Were there any accidents? So those are things that are constantly happening through somebody's daily experience with their vehicles. Now, are there some of these transactions that could be leveraged to supplement or be used as mileage reporting? These, for example, when you get your when you get your oil changed, most mechanics are actually noting down your odometer reading and submitting them to these VIN lookup services. So if a user could say, well, instead of me having to self-report each time, I'm going to just have that sent over to DOL, and that whenever I get oil change, that way I don't even have to run out to my car every single time I have to register my vehicle. DOL has that data on what my odometer reading is right now. So the idea is to capture as many of these vehicle transactions that we do as vehicle owners throughout the year, and see if there are additional opportunities that we might miss or that are happening that we can look at for mileage reporting. So some of the metrics are taking a look at what typical activities vehicle owners have, And then the idea is to maybe have them journal and write down every single time that they have a vehicle transaction related to a road that could be used for a road usage charge or vehicle registration. And as they move through this, throughout the period that they're kind of journaling, that will help us identify good opportunities. In some cases, this might be registration renewal, maintenance, refueling, recharging vehicle are those good opportunities to look at a road usage charge. Cost effectiveness. What is the most cost-effective way of collecting RUC payments that doesn't place undue burden on the end user? And then equity. Are there other more cost-effective RUC fee collection and methods that are equitable as opposed to the ones that have been proposed to date? Next slide. So what we'll do is at the very beginning, this is a 6 to 9 month pilot. We'll design kind of the journaling vehicle transactions research process and recruit vehicle owners, ensure that it's representative of a lot of different demographics, and then provide them a log where they can note all of their vehicle transactions. We'll also develop and design a survey tool to document the participant journey and then look for opportunities along the way, maybe every 3 months or so, check in with them, whether it be a focus group or a touch point, an email or a phone call to find out, well, do you have anything to let us know? This type of journaling can be a little bit difficult in terms of keeping people engaged, but it's the most useful if you have a longer period where you're engaged with the same person. So a lot of these transactions happen only once a year or every quarter. So we want to make sure we're capturing all the opportunities throughout the year. So each transaction point has a survey tied to it that asks about the type of transaction, what type of reporting that occurred, all the decision making that happens that may not be on paper that happens. So, oh, well, was it, for example, what reminded you to go get your oil change? Was it the sticker up at the top of your windshield, or was it the light that came on in your vehicle? Do you have it just programmed into your calendar, or did you get a phone call from your mechanic? What triggered all of these transactions? And then if the type of payments that could be made, what people thought about the quality of the transactions. For example, if it's your car dealer, sometimes they'll offer to do additional things for you. And one of the things that they may be able to do is collect your RUC or submit an odometer reading for you while your vehicle is then in there already. They could ask, can I just report your odometer reading for you? It's done. It's an additional service being offered and value added for businesses. Then we'll interview representatives from the most promising transactions, those that seem to maybe have could help with cost reduction, user experience, and equity, and then look at the feasibility of collecting RUC, either data or payment through those methods. We're looking at about 100 to 200 Washington drivers for this mini pilot. Okay, last mini pilot. So this one is a mock standards committee. We've been talking for several months now about, well, what about interoperability? We want to begin discussions around testing the process for development, maybe, and testing of standards that could support RUC systems and applications and services. The reason that I bring up interoperability first is the fact that if you think about it, if Washington has to work with every single other state out there on interoperability, then, and if we're already not agreeing on terminology, so Washington would be working with, Oregon on RUC, but if you're working with some states further east, they're working on MBUF together. If we can't even have the same terminology of what we're working on together, then as you get down into the more and more details and layers, there's going to be a lot of inconsistencies to the point where sometimes it might become very difficult to interoperate if fundamental concepts about RUC are different. So for example, we're looking at maybe coming up with what the definition of road usage charge is. We've talked about different rates. If every single state has multiple rates and Washington needs to interoperate with them, how do we handle communicating about what the rates are. And some states might charge in state or out of state, or not be tracking where those miles are. So understanding how states might want to keep track of that, not keep track of it, and work together is key to kind of this interoperation. And then if that can be agreed, some standards or certification or reciprocity agreements can be discussed. So we're looking at creating opportunities also for vendors. It's really important. If I think we were talking about earlier today in one of the presentations about, well, what does it cost if we have to switch vendors? Well, if vendors have to come in and learn every single state from scratch, it's going to cost them quite a lot, and to customize a system for every state. So if states can design their systems more similarly, that means then vendors can produce more custom off-the-shelf types of systems to support RUC, meaning the cost of providing systems to states can be much lower. So looking at that area and standardizing maybe data requirements, interfaces, architectures would really help with keeping costs low when interfacing with third-party systems. Keeping the door open for new market entry. So right now we know that there are some vendors and third parties interested in road usage charge. We've conducted pilots with them. Well, we want to make sure that that door stays open. The more vendors that you have, the more competitive the procurements are. But if we can't, we want to make sure that new vendors can also enter the market. Standards can actually encourage innovation in the supply of systems, as long as they're not hard-coded. If they're open standards, then and if they're written not at, for a single point in time, open and agnostic to different technologies that might be introduced later, that could definitely help in encouraging innovations and allowing adoption of new technologies much more quickly when they're available. And then again, I think I've mentioned the ease of procurement. So sorry, I've got these two confused. Economies of scale. If an entire region can work together on standardizing their road usage charge systems, definitions, interfaces, there may be economies of scale for multiple systems to work together to procure RUC services. So some key assumptions behind this mini pilot is that there probably is enough exploration of road usage charge with the number of states, as Travis had mentioned earlier. It's expanding to begin some standardization of commonalities around road usage charge. There are also that RUC standards are best developed with both government and industry participation, not by one or the other. And then RUC standards should take into account known technologies, but also not be dependent on them. So metrics for this mock standards committee is the ability to reach consensus on some of the objectives, the highest ones, and maybe a scope of standardization. The idea is to maybe invite some members of other states, vendor community, to participate in this mock committee and see, okay, are we able to agree on some of these objectives? What standards might be the most useful to start with? At the end of the mock committee, talk to these members and participants to see what they thought was it useful? Was it a good investment of time? Was a lot of information learned in just the simple exchange of presenting each other, for example, how our road usage charge is envisioned? Do we see any areas where that barriers to interoperability might arise so that we can address them early and upfront? And also taking a look at whether the membership that was invited is diverse, and so that we can see if this other members or stakeholders should be invited to be at the table to develop standards. Next slide. So this is envisioned to be a three-month discovery phase to take a look at, to kind of initiate the discussion with peer states on a potential membership structure. Setup phase to look at the committee structure, operating rules and guidelines, logistics of holding a mock standards committee, and then finally piloting the mock standards committee over about 6 months. So we would simulate the 3-day sessions to talk through very specific details, starting with the objectives and the structure of the committee, begin development of a reference architecture based on a generalization of RUC solutions. So it won't be Washington specific or Oregon specific, but can we come up with a general definition of RUC and all the functions and features that are included in RUC? Look at common terminology, concepts, and building blocks, which are key to developing standards. And then look at what are some of the interoperability data exchange needs in the long run to simplify interoperability between states and possibly also a national road usage charge. So that is the last one, mini pilot, and I'll take any further questions now. Yes, Representative Orcutt.
I got a couple of questions, if I may. First, on number 1, you're looking at doing a 1 to 2 month pilot, but it's an annual registration. So I'm wondering how you're going to capture enough people in that 1 to 2 months, because you're only going to, you've only got, 1/6 of the population or 1/6 of the registrations that would be eligible in that 2-month period. And then I'll have a couple of questions on number 8.
So I think that will be a large enough population. We're not looking to make sure that we survey everybody throughout the year, but we're only looking for about, I think it was 200 participants, or 50 to 100 participants in number 1. So hopefully it's simply just walking through the process. The process should be the same throughout the year. So hopefully that will give us enough feedback to understand when you go to your vehicle registration, how you might want to see a road usage charge or not.
And then my questions on number 8, the unregistered vehicle research. You say that, the time lapse actually can be for quite some time, but they generally will renew. Are you finding that the average is about 3 months before they renew? Because that's what you're using as an evaluation period of 3 months. And then my second question on that is, how are you going to reach out to these folks so that when you're trying to interview them and get information, they don't just go click, or if it's email, they just hit delete. Wait a minute, the Washington State Transportation Commission is checking up on me. Am I now in trouble? How are you going to give them some confidence that this is strictly about research before they can, hit the delete button or hang up the phone on you?
Absolutely, that's a great question. Let's see. So the first question you had was about the length of time that people are unregistered for. Right now, there isn't very much data out there about that length of time. So what we'd like to do is create exactly that profile, is to be able to draw out, well, how long is that time period? And is there, particular reasons for that we can help to affect or impact? If it ends up being that a large portion of people are unregistered for longer than 3 months, we can continue monitoring that over time. So right now we've got it at 3+ months, but we can look again at 6 or 9 months later at the same vehicles that we have in the database and check back with DOL and say, hey, are these people now registered? So hopefully, that eventually will start to tail off a little bit over time. The second question that you had was about reaching the folks that are lapsed. There are definitely survey methods to ensure that people feel comfortable with opening up and being willing to participate in this type of survey that is sensitive. So our idea is maybe we could try, there are survey survey methods, for example, just ensuring that the data is completely kept anonymous, private, going through an independent firm to do the survey of the folks that are lapsed. If that is, if we decide that that's not the way we want to go, if it's associated with Washington, negatively, then we can also do kind of a random method, and particularly the ones that did eventually become compliant again. We can ask them, we can even say, thank you, start out with that. We wanted to help improve your customer experience process and make sure that you can stay compliant. So understanding kind of what those factors along the entire spectrum of people that end up lapsing. So we will do the best that we can to reach out to people with all different backgrounds and challenges and talk to them. If it takes doing it completely confidentially, we will take a look at doing that way.
Any other questions? Okay. So now we have about 30 minutes for your thoughts, get your input regarding the 2022 plan as it was presented to you. Who would like to start the discussion? Quick meeting.
Roy,
Yes.
this is Judy.
Hey, Judy.
I would just like to say I was very impressed today. I thought that a lot of things came together, have sat through a lot of statistics and typical stuff that we have to go through. But today it sort of felt like we could paint a picture of a way forward that I felt was very well put out there. And I'm looking forward to the interaction with people that we're all going to have to explain this to, because it'll be so new to them. We should expect a huge education process, but I thought everybody did a wonderful job, and I just wanted to let you know, because I have to get off here in a second.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else? One of the quickest discussions we've had. Okay, we'll move on. So now I need to ask, does anyone have an objection to the project team carrying forward with the work plan as it was presented? I don't see no hands raised. I'm looking through everybody's pictures. Good, because that means I don't have to say this big spill I've got to say. Okay, I think we now have a better understanding of how to proceed. I want to thank everybody for their help in the 22 demonstration project plan. It was very helpful and a lot of information. I want to encourage everyone to participate in the 22 demonstration testing to help save time so we don't have to go through it here. Rima will be in touch with you with specific opportunities for volunteering in the pilot tests. So with that, now we'll hear again from Jing on next steps. Take it away.
Okay, great. So let's see, the next steps that we have are, we're gonna be, looking at the upcoming research activities. So there was gonna be a task report on the research activities, the financial model analysis, the equity outreach, the rec innovation, and the cost of collection workshop series. Oh, sorry. Annalise, no, that was on the next slide. Oh. Annalise, do you have another slide there? And one more. Sorry about that. Here we go. Okay. And then if you go to the next slide after that. So first of all, what we're going to do, thank you everybody for your feedback on and concerns about the pilot. We'll be doing the final designs, evaluation planning, and system development testing of the particular pilots. So each one of them will have their own little mini plan, including everything from how we're going to actually do evaluation all the way down to how we're going to participate, recruit for those particular participants that we look for. So as you saw, you know, some people will have to have native telematics available to them. Others will need to be interested in other mileage reporting methods, low income, geographic distribution. We'll need to make sure that we're getting, we have a plan to reach out to all those types of participants. Alongside of that, we're hoping the steering committee will continue participating in the spotlight sessions. We'll continue providing feedback on where the mini pilots are going. We will present the evaluation plan and also the recruitment plan for all of those. Would love to get all of your feedback and ideas around that, as you said, to help recruit people from all over the state. In summer of 2022, we will start the staggered launch of the mini pilots. Once we come up with these plans for each of the mini pilots, we'll start slotting them in over the year because some of them are a little bit more dependent on that first tab renewal method. So some of them will have to wait until those that one's been a little bit becomes stabilized. Others, we might be able to get started with some of the research and preliminary activities early on. So we'll have a big picture schedule of all of that. And then we'll present in July the launch of the mini pilots and how we're going to start doing member enrollment and participation. In Q3 and Q4, that's when we're actually going to be operating the mini pilots and performing the ongoing evaluation of the mini pilots. And so we'll have a meeting in about December to report on the pilot progress. And I think that's it. So any questions about those next steps?
Doesn't seem like it.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, so that's it. But before we adjourn the meeting, I'd like to give the steering committee time to make any additional comments that they would like to make. Not everybody talk at once now. Okay, so with that, I want to thank everyone for their time today. I also want to thank them for their participation. It was a great meeting. Thanks, everyone. And with that, we'll adjourn the meeting at 1:58. We stand adjourned.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.
Yes, I forgot that. I'm on Florida time still.
Thank you, Roy.
My wife just commented. Thanks, everyone. Outstanding job.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.